Good afternoon. When I was here earlier, I had some downtime, so I worked here, and I was listening to the texts. And one of them was like, well, you know, sometimes they're very soft, but then some people have voices that boom. I knew he was talking about me. I didn't say anything. He knows what I'm talking about. I just kind of smiled. But good afternoon and welcome to the 12th meeting of the Community Safety Advisory Commission. It's good to see everyone here today. The first thing we're going to do would be the approval of the minutes, but let me point out a couple of things about the minutes, and we may need the help of some of the commissioners. So where it says staff present, I know that Jeff Furby, Commander Meter, and Chief Quinlan were not in attendance, and neither was Kate. Elon, Brian, and George were there. Anyone else from staff that you can recall?
Since I wasn't there, I didn't have, and I tried to look at the video to see who was there, but I never, that's all I could, because these are just the list from the last
Right,
month.
right, and I actually talked to Denise about it, and she tried to make changes, but somehow she couldn't, so we'll just have those individuals as not attending, and I think that's it.
Okay.
So with that correction to the minutes, can I get a motion for approval?
So moved.
Thank you. A second?
Second.
Second. All in favor, raise your hands. Any opposition, same sign. Minutes are approved. A couple of housekeeping matters before we even get into the subcommittee reports. A couple of things that I want to share. One, in reading the minutes, we still need an answer to this. Did Elon come in? I'll say Brian. It came up at our last meeting whether or not, and I think it would be if there were any minutes that were taken or any type of record keeping from the subcommittees, are they subject to the public records law? And I think Brian has an answer for us.
Yes, subject to public records law, not subject to public meetings, provided that less than half of the commissioners are present.
Okay, all right, thank you. I had the pleasure this morning of meeting with the president of Matrix, our consulting company, Richard Brady, and we decided coming out of that meeting, and I don't know if it's going to be Richard or someone else from Matrix, they would like to meet with the commissioners individually, and so staff, Elon probably will provide your information. They contacted me by my email. There was an administrative type person that set up, the meeting time. So I would, you don't have to, but I thought you might find it interesting to actually meet with them one-on-one to share your perspectives of the commission, where we are and our work. So expect to hear from them. As Richard and I were talking, we talked a little bit about time frame. And at this point, I'm not sure if when we started our meetings, if I would have been so bold as to speculate as to how long our work would take. If I did, it probably needs to be a revision. So Richard and I are both on the same page that we're probably talking about another 4 to 5 months before we would be at the point of actually having final recommendations to present to the city. So I want to keep you informed. I know it's going to be even, I think we've scheduled through the end of the year. If not, I don't know if we tried to fit one in December. I'll take, a look at that, but I do realize it's the holidays and it's going to be very, very challenging. And again, I'm going to work with the internal team, and if possible, I want us to have our future meetings on the calendar much sooner, so that we're doing it more than 30 or 45 days out from the meeting. So we will do that. Andrea, you're up for a subcommittee report, the hiring subcommittee?
Yes.
This is your second meeting you've had?
This is our second meeting, and our goal for this meeting, for this past meeting, was to talk specifically about recruiting. And we had two groups on our agenda. One was to benchmark with the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. We understand they have a robust recruitment process. And then to meet again with Sergeant Chris Smith-Hughes and Commander Joseph Schrader. Unfortunately, based upon the schedule with Franklin County employees, they were unable to attend that meeting. Emily's in contact with them and in communication. She was able to provide some information that they could share with us, and we talked about that as subcommittee members, and we also hope to get them back to our subcommittee probably in the beginning of the new year based on their calendars. So we look to see that because they are local, and it seems that they are pretty successful in how they are addressing diversity. We know from the larger commission presentation that Sergeant Chris Smith-Hughes and his group are working very hard, and that he has been in that group since January of 2018. So we understand that they're working with new data. We understand that they're capturing data, and they are sorting through their own internal processes to do the job and address diversity on the police force. Commissioners were able to submit questions to Elon, and he presented those questions to Sergeant Smith-Hughes and Commander Schrader. So they came prepared to talk with us and responded to our questions, and we were appreciative of that. We know that they're looking to increase diversity. They feel that they're on the right track. We also know that based upon our smaller group and the bigger group, that there is some funding opportunities, greater funding opportunities that should be looked at realistically and honestly for that group. So not only in addition to the financial aspect with the budget, but also employee resources to have them dedicated. And again, we understand that some officers are pulled and moved into different areas in their responsibilities, but to do the job that needs to be done and the outreach and relationship building that they want to pursue, that's something that we're looking at and we're delving into a little bit more. Discussions of interest included how internal applicants from other city employment can be looked at. They are already within city employment. They are, good employees, and how can they be identified as good applicants for the Columbus Division of Police, and maybe looking at some type of selection process to their benefit. We also talked about building upon the current Explorer program. That seems to be a really good pool of young people who absolutely are fitting the core values for the division, and then talked about the new cadet program and how that can also be a robust pool of candidates. Again, if we're looking at young people, if we're looking at pulling them from our communities and them going back to the communities and speaking positively about the police department, that's the groups that they want to dedicate their resources to, and so they're passionate about those two groups. Our next meeting is on November 29th from 11:30 to 1:30 at the offices of Franklin County Children's Services. The topic for that meeting is the actual hiring process, and we've requested that a representative from the Civil Service Commission be present. We have 3 specific areas that we want to go in depth more with them to get a greater understanding how that fits in recruiting as we continue to bring the threads to that tapestry together. And then we also made contact with a former individual who worked in recruiting, who's no longer with the Division of Police, Anthony Wilson, who's now the Director of Safety and Security with the Columbus Metropolitan Library, and going to speak with him about his past experiences as recruitment with the division. So we want to expand our benchmarking and couch that with the internal discussions that we get at this commission.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Is the cadet program operating now, or is it something for the future?
Our understanding is that it's a new proposed program.
It's a new proposal. The mayor, in his budget announcement yesterday, unveiled that. It will be both in Division of Fire and the Division of Police.
Okay, all right, thank you. That's good news. Anything else from the commissioners? Then we're going to, we have a special presentation today. And Brian, I don't know if you wanted to introduce our guests, or should I just go forward? Okay. I believe that all of the commissioners received a little bit of background on Benchmark. It was a 2-pager, and specifically you saw just a couple of paragraphs about the work, and then some background on the CEO and co-founder of Benchmark, Mr. Ron Huberman. And I told him, I mean, I read this, and I'm not trying to embarrass him in any way, but when I read the positions that he has held, I couldn't think of anyone where they were more divergent from, being in a police department, being chief of staff for mayor, being president of the Chicago Transit Authority, and then being the CEO and superintendent of Chicago Public Schools. I mean, that is quite a diverse background. So I want to welcome Ron and his associate here today. He has asked, and I have said, yes, we can do this. On the agenda, you see that he had from 2:40 to 3:30. So it's about 2:45, but he believes that he can give his presentation in about 25 minutes without questions. And that will then give us more time to ask him questions when he's finished. And so I know this can be challenging when it's top of mind, but if you would please just jot your questions down, I believe we'll have enough time to get them all answered. Ron?
Great, thank you. And they've asked me to talk into the mic here, which I'm really bad at, so I'm going to move this a little bit because I like to walk around. But thank you, Commissioner, so much for having me. Sarah Kremsmer is my co-founder at Benchmark Analytics, and I appreciate the work of the commissioners of the commission. This is always such important work that you are engaged in here, and I've seen in other like cities that have taken on this difficult task. So thank you for your service. I'm not going to spend any much time on my background or Sarah. Sarah also has an equally expansive background in government, but other than to say we spent most of our careers in city government. I'm not going to talk so much today about Benchmark, but I'd just like to take a moment and tell you about our organization and what brought us together in the world of public safety. At the time, one of our founding board members was a guy named Chuck Ramsey. And for those of you who've heard those names, Chuck was one of the co-chairs of President Obama's 21st Century Commission on Policing. And when Chuck came out of that work, along with a guy named R.T. Ryback, who's another founding board member, R.T. was the 3-term mayor of Minneapolis. And myself and Sarah and a few other folks, we said, well, these are really powerful vision of policing in the future and looking at it prospectively. But it struck us that in so many of the recommendations of that commission, that without software that could be operationalized into police departments, without being able to leverage really thoughtful research, it would be very difficult to accomplish many of the things that commission ultimately recommended in terms of where we go as a nation around policing. And so ultimately, with our founding board members, along with the Joyce Foundation, that's a partial owner and gives us grants from the Joyce Foundation that I know has been a partner to the city here before, and the University of Chicago, which is also a part owner of Benchmark Analytics, all came together to say, let's take their really cutting-edge research from the Center for Data Science for the Public Good, let's fund it with the research consortium from the Joyce Foundation, and let's marry it with practitioners from the field of policing to deliver a different way to think about managing personnel in the police setting. We are not about the crime side, we are all about the people side of the equation when it comes to policing. So with that as the background, a lot of what I'm going to have the opportunity to share with you today is information about how we think personnel should be effectively led and managed in the context of the police department. What is probably may be frustrating to you today or may not be frustrating to you today is the lack of kind of very quantitative research-based studies that you can point to that say, wow, this is a really effective practice in policing that's very transformative. It's ultimately, I would argue to you, because as a field, we don't have the research base to point to super quantitative studies that say this specific intervention leads to fundamentally better police conduct, or this kind of policing is transformative in terms of its ability to build bridges with communities. That research is very much the work that we're doing because in many ways, it's very thin in terms of what can be turned to that's very practical. So with that as a background, let me go into a few high-level themes, and I'm going to try to stay very high level. The first thing I'm going to argue to you, and what we've seen, is that when you look at the current state of the state in policing, and hopefully I can hold onto this mic and walk. I don't know if that's going to, is that all right? All right, that works. All right, thanks. Is that to date, when thinking about police conduct in America, by the way, I'm going to make general statements about policing, and they may or not be, because I'm not versed in kind of the local, the Columbus Police Department, may or may not be applicable. I'm going to argue to you likely in most cases they're going to be very applicable, is that the world of evaluation has focused on two arenas, right? The judgment of, is this officer doing an effective job, or is this officer not doing an effective job? And it typically falls into the bucket of use of force and internal affairs. Does an officer have sustained complaints or a series of complaints, and how much force is being utilized? And those are typically pulled out and stripped out as kind of sole barometers of judgment. What we've seen from the research is that there's a whole bunch of areas that are needed to be pulled together and viewed to understand from a holistic perspective, right, whether an officer is on track, whether an officer is off track, right, and thinking about if they're off track, right, what are the ways to get them back on track? And as I go through this, I'll talk about some of the early findings that we have. Now, one of the things when I say early findings from a research perspective, right, I will tell you which of these are published and which of these are not published. And to the degree that they're not published, it means we are likely to have findings on these things, but it's still in play. We took a look and we cataloged a bunch of things. So the first thing we cataloged is we went to every Department of Justice consent decree and MOU that was ever created. We actually read all of them and said, what are all of the like elements that are recommended from all of those studies in terms of what are the data elements you should be tracking and looking at? We looked at IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police Best Practices. We looked at PERF recommendations, the Police Executive Research Forum, and we looked at CALIA accreditation requirements. Not that these things are be-all or all research-based, but fundamentally, when you boil them down, they break down into these 7 buckets of things that should be occurring in terms of holistically thinking about a workforce in the policing environment. So let me talk about what that looks like. In officer profile for us, it's a lot of the basics that need to be tracked, but it's things like injury on duty, it's things like sick leave, it would be things such as issued equipment, lost equipment. We're going to call it the 101s, but there are things in there that really matter. Bucket 2 is training. In the training arena, there are lots of best practices that we have observed from other industries that are not standard in policing, and I'm going to highlight one. So if we take a look at the current state of the state in American K-12 education, right, so outside of the standard that work that we live in, the mantra very much is, and what the research shows, is that individualized professional development at the teacher level drives tremendous results for students. As a field in the world of policing, what we see today is it's still very much, I'm going to train all second-year officers in the following course of training, right? Or an officer has been on the job for 5 years, right? And we as a field don't stop and take a look at the data and diagnostics to say, where is this officer excelling and where is this officer struggling, and thinking about their individual performance and their individual training. Because much like if I try to create a universal training for everyone in this room, all of you are likely going to be very strong at certain things, right? And a few of you might struggle in a few things, right? But to the degree that we could understand that, we could differentiate the training. And so in our world, as we think about this, having a very granular learning management system for training that helps individualize officer plans of support, right, will be to the degree that those officers excel. And getting away from kind of standard mandated, everyone needs the following training, and really trying to individualize it seems to show a great deal of promise as it relates to training. We also think in the FTO world, so field training, when you have officers that are in those beginning states, is having a very document-based, competency-based training program that doesn't have a set timeline. And what do I mean by that? So let's say, as an example, in the field training officer world, right, you have an officer who's starting that training, and ultimately the department determines there are 52 competencies that we want this officer to have, right? Those competencies might be around community engagement. They might be about documenting a domestic violence situation, arrest, utilization of force, a whole bunch of stuff. Right? We would argue that it may take some officers 16 weeks, right, based on both the circumstance that they experience on the street to both validate and show that they have those experiences, right? Other officers may need to be on their 5th domestic, violence call before they really master that particular competency. And allowing for a large degree of flexibility and tracking and managing to those competencies, right, ensures that when that officer is on the street independently, they really have all of those underlying skills and abilities that we want to see in every officer, versus trying to fit that into any kind of set parameter or time frame. But training is a key part of, if you will, the dashboard of holistically looking at an officer. We would also argue that what we are finding in data analysis from police departments is the data also tells the story often about where is that individualized support and professional development for that officer needed. So if you're trying to figure out how can we best support an officer to be the best officer they can be, very often there is a data trail that says, wow, this officer needs extra training in this particular arena, versus a generalized training that might be provided to a whole grouping of officers. Activity, and we're going to come back to this in the next slide. But fundamentally, any good system has to understand what are the metrics of activity and how do we normalize for activity. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment because I'm going to talk about it in the early warning context. Use of force is a catch-all for us, but fundamentally, we are happy to provide to the chair some of the underlying work that I'll be discussing here. But in the use of force, there are actually 15 incident types that, from the best practice research we have, are things that need to be tracked and managed to. Very much not from a punitive perspective at all, but from the perspective of what are about these activity types, right, that might suggest that an officer needs extra support in one area or is excelling in one area. But tracking use of force at a granular level matters a lot. The other quick thing I'll say about, as we think about use of force, then we'll talk about it, is context of use of force matters a tremendous amount. And when I talk about early warning, I will talk a lot about the context of where force is used, and thinking about force as a one-size-fits-all, meaning an officer has 3 use of forces, is really flawed because how the force is applied in what context turns out to be, from a research perspective, really predictive of whether that officer is involved in problematic or not problematic conduct. IA matters, so IA cases coming in matters a lot. From our overwhelming research is that if you have a series of complaints, generally speaking, right, and they're from multiple complainants, right, whether those complaints are sustained or not sustained, purely from a predictive perspective, that officer is very likely to end up over the long term with sustained internal affairs complaints, right? So it would argue when there's a lot of smoke from a lot of different folks, the research would suggest that over time, it will bear out to show that there's a problem. Now, to everything I'm saying, there are, of course, exceptions, but as a general rule, the data is pretty strong that when there's a lot of smoke, there will be a fire as it relates to IA complainants sourced from multiple locations. Community engagement is a really critical metric that today in the field is typically missing. And what we mean by community engagement lives at several levels, but at a very fundamental level, how does someone feel when they have completed interacting with an officer? Because you may have an officer that has great crime-fighting chops, they are following policy, they are not violating any of the guardrails, if you will, of what is expected from rules of conduct, but the folks who interact with that officer walk away not feeling good about the interaction, and ultimately it reflects poorly on the department and it deteriorates against trust. So in our world, the way we think about community engagement is what is a way to develop a score and a metric to understand how do people feel when they have completed engaging with this officer. So in our world, it involves a text-based or a email-based survey for every interaction that provides a score. And again, the purpose of that score, right, is to understand and help provide thoughtful feedback to that officer about how are they being perceived. And there's baby steps to it, but what I would suggest here today is that a holistic view of an officer that doesn't have some form of a community engagement score is really problematic. Community engagement is not just on the interaction, it's also against time spent. And to date, in the world of police community CAD system, computer-aided dispatch system, and RMS systems, right, they are good at capturing when there was a 911 call, how much time did you have, and what was the disposition. But all of that proactive time that might be building bridges, developing relationships, spending time to get the kind of relationships needed in the community are not tracked. And so community engagement from a policy perspective, we argue, needs to happen at the interaction level. There has to be a way to know and provide feedback to an officer about perception. And there needs to be a reporting mechanism created so that all of this time that's spent is credited, right? The officers get credit for that time spent in community engagement. And then finally, the last thing we would say about is that in a performance evaluation system, it's very important that whoever is completing that performance evaluation has a holistic dashboard in front of them that helps them think about that officer holistically at the time they're completing the performance evaluation. So what might that mean? Well, it means they might know about what is going on in terms of that officer missing work, what's going on with secondary employment, has this officer been injured, right? Where are they on their individualized training plan, right? What does their activity look like, right? What is their application of force? What is their IA complaints? How are they being perceived by the folks in the community who are engaging with them? If we empowered supervisors with that core data, right, not necessarily as guidelines for what they need to do in the performance evaluation, but to have a holistic view of that individual at the time they're completing that performance evaluation, we think needs to become a modern best practice standard in policing. And to the degree that you're trying to evaluate someone without that holistic picture, right, then it won't be a holistic evaluation. And theoretically, you could be missing things that only by really understanding the data would that be clear. We think this is particularly compelling in the police context because so much of policing is shift work, right? And so much of the time is independent. So a supervisor is not likely to be on the bulk of those calls riding along with the officer, right? So they may not have insight into a pattern, right, where it could become clear from the underlying data. So bucket number one that we're gonna, to summarize this, is that use of force and IA is important data and it should no way be ignored, but we need to think about this much more broadly and much more holistically, and a community engagement component must be part of that narrative that's there. Today, almost without exception, it's very hard to find an early warning system that moves beyond counting internal affairs and use of force, right? And we think that's just very short-sighted. This is bucket one. I'm going to try to move fast here. So let's talk about the future of early warning systems. And let me start by talking about the current state of early warning systems. So the current state of early warning systems typically will involve some version of a trigger. And let me give you an example of a trigger. If you have 3 of these events in Y window of time, you get triggered. The University of Chicago did research in this area, and they found that trigger systems, even when they're based on some kind of statistical analysis, are widely flawed. I'm going to go much further and say that many early warning systems in this country have led to depolicing. And they have led to depolicing because they have flagged officers, and no one wants to be flagged, right? Anyone who's doing their job, once they're flagged, are very likely to go, whoa, right? Because they're engaged in a lot of activity. When it's bean counting only without context, right, the research suggests you end up with a lot of false positives, and there's an example where you have departments with the false positive rate is 40%. Now, what do I mean by false positive? It means folks who are identified as having a problem, right, but don't ultimately ever end up with a sustained complaint, okay? And then you end up with the opposite, and it's a smaller number. It hovers between 20 to 30%, where there's a false negative, where you have someone who's engaged in fundamentally problematic conduct, but it's never identified. Now, why is that? No one's exactly sure, other than the math in these systems are kind of flawed. I'm going to give you 3 reasons we think it's a problem, right? But at the most fundamental level is without the context in the peer group, right? It's very hard to understand, relatively speaking, what are the challenges that those officers are facing. So let me give a little light to it. But this is really trigger-based systems of what exists today. The Joyce Foundation is currently sponsoring our work along with the ongoing work that the University of Chicago has done in places like Nashville, and they've done research with Charlotte-Mecklenburg and other cities, studying their data to understand, right, what makes for a holistic early warning system and what actually triggers, what are things that would be problematic. First thing I'll say is if you've built the infrastructure for a good early warning system, right, it should absolutely be alerting for exceptional conduct as well as alerting for problematic conduct, right? And only doing, again, one side of that can be fundamentally problematic. So let me give 3 things that a research-based early warning system needs to have, and it's the work that we do. So the first is the concept of peer group, which sounds very obvious, right? But if you have a midnight officer in a higher crime part of town versus a day officer in a quiet residential part of town, fundamentally they just can't be compared to the same because the level of violence and the issues that they're facing are likely going to be different, which might mean the threshold ultimately in a peer group is much lower for that day officer in a quiet residential neighborhood, right? 2 significant use of force events in in that neighborhood might be a lot more alarming than 5, right, in an area where relative to the workload of that officer, one would suggest. So peer groups are really important. This is becoming extra important as policing specializes, as we train officers, an example, to deal with issues of mental health. And we have specialized officers with specialized training who are going to be differentially dispatched. Not understanding that in an early warning system is really a dangerous road. So peer groups matter a lot. The second thing that matters a lot, and this is not a published finding, but it's en route, is context. And I'm going to give you a really quick real-world example to understand context as we think about it. So let's say you have an officer respond to a strong-arm robbery. So they approach someone, they take something off their person with their hands, right? They're not armed. So a strong-arm robbery. The officer responds, they meet the victim, they take the victim for a ride. 2 blocks away, the victim positively identifies the offender. The officer goes to effect the arrest, and in effecting that arrest, uses a moderate to high level of force. In our world, that example of that utilization of force ranks exceptionally low. Now, why is that? Because what we have found from our early research is that when you have the arrest of an offender for a Part 1 crime associated with a signed complainant, it rarely ever suggests that there is a fundamentally problematic pattern. Meaning when we see that in that context, the research just doesn't suggest we see those officers with sustained issues. Now let me give you the flip side. Now let's say you have an officer who's got 3 on-view discretionary arrests. 2 of those have the offender resisting, and 1 of those has some level of injury. That is a huge red flag in our world because generally speaking, that context of utilization of force associated with discretionary arrests where you have consistently offenders resisting, right, and as reported, right, that's very problematic, and typically we will see those individuals with the sustained complaint over a window of time. So I would just argue to you again, as you think about the world of early warning, context matters. Now the third piece of it is the preventative piece. So long before you have a complaint come in, what are bellwethers or things to suggest, hey, let's positively intervene with this officer before we have a problem? And I'll give you another real world example of a city that we're involved in. So I can tell you that on the south end of that city, on average, we're seeing an officer use a moderate level of force every 210 domestic violence calls for service, right? On average, right? Just as a general number. We can tell you there's a small group of officers who are north of, on average, 700 calls for service with little or no utilization of force, okay? And we're normalizing for arrest data, we're normalizing for case report data. What do we know about those officers? We know that they have exceptional conduct, right? Because they're very good at de-escalation, because we see them confronting the same quantity of work, if you will, with the same challenges, and they are doing it in such a way where they're de-escalating the situation, right? Those would be individuals, in my opinion, that would be flagged for that exceptional conduct, right? Understanding who they are is critically important. We can tell you in that particular city, there's a smaller group of officers that are using a moderate to high level of force every 20 domestic violence calls for service. When you can see that data, it just kind of screams out at you that says, hey, these are folks who need support and training in de-escalation, right? We need to know who they are, we need to offer them that training, and we need to give them a path to be more effective, right? Or if not, then we need to take other intervention type steps with those individuals. But understanding from an early warning perspective at that granular level across call types, across activities, is a very critical component to anything that looks like a research-based early warning system that's out there. And we call that, in our bucket, is how we think about that from a preventive perspective. Another non-published, dangerous, right, but early finding that we have, which is kind of interesting, is when we think about shifting culture in policing, and we think about early warning systems, and we think about awards, right? What are the awards that departments give? In two contexts, and two contexts doesn't necessarily mean it's replicable, but what we're finding is that there's not a relationship between the quantities of awards an officer has, right, and their ability to de-escalate violence. Or stated differently, the officers who have the most awards, right, are also in the upper quartile for utilization of force. So from a culture perspective of building expectation, having the right awards and systems to say, let's raise up those officers who are very good at de-escalation as a pattern of conduct is a really important thing to think about. And being able to understand that underlying data so that those officers can be recognized, we would argue too, is really important. And building an early warning system with that capacity arms you with the data to understand both sides of that equation as you think about systems that are available and out there. And then the last thing we would say as you're doing your research as a commission is our reading on the DOJ consent decrees, clear accreditation standard, ICP, and the like, is such that a lot of it they're all pointing to the same things if you're doing all that research. And the things that they're pointing to all also generally align with what we find in our research around predictors from an early warning system that are problematic. We find it a solid group of recommendations to think about and think about replicating from a policy perspective in what they recommend to track, because ultimately those things also tell a pretty robust story of performance. And then finally, as we think about this, the last thing I would say is that as policing in general, and we think about the science of policing, let me tell you where we've not gone. Where we've not gone as a field is the so what. And what I mean by the so what is to the degree that an early warning system has identified someone as having problematic conduct, okay, what do? So the state of the state, again, in policing today in America is discipline. So we don't think about patterns, we think about incidents. So rather than saying holistically, is Ron Huberman a good officer? We say, well, what happened in this incident? You got a complaint. Internal Affairs investigates that complaint. It's ultimately sustained and it's not sustained, right? If it's not sustained, nothing happens. If it's sustained, some level of discipline is issued and the officer serves that discipline. In the world of early warning, right, you end up in a conundrum. And the ultimate conundrum will look like this. The data suggests that there's a problem. The data is going to predict from a research perspective that this pattern, right, suggests this officer's conduct is off track. But there's not a sustained incident, right, by which to leverage discipline. And by the way, we haven't seen discipline be an agent for change. We don't have any evidence to suggest, wow, discipline is really altering conduct in a meaningful way, right? So then the question becomes, what do you recommend? What do you do when you see a pattern? But there might be 5 in open internal affairs investigations. Those need to take their time. They will adjudicate over a window of time. They will come out where they are. So there's been really no body of research to say what are research-based interventions that are non-disciplinary, non-punitive, and we think that's incredibly important. And the reason we think non-disciplinary, non-punitive is so important is because it can't violate the collective bargaining agreement, right? They need to be things that can be done now to support that officer, to improve that conduct, right, on an ongoing basis that doesn't rely on an internal affairs case that might pop out 18 months later. So the work that we are trying to figure out, and again, I'm always going to be grateful to my funders, but the Joyce Foundation is generously funding a research consortium of leading universities from across the country, hosted at the University of Chicago, that is currently cataloging research-based interventions, again, non-disciplinary, non-punitive, that have been shown to have promise around improving officer conduct. And again, I'll give you a non-published one that seems to be really promising. So one intervention that we're very excited about is assigning a supervisor as a mentor. Now, that can be great or not great. Hey, Ron, keep an eye out on Sarah, will you? I got it, right? Not particularly compelling. but a highly structured intervention that forces that frontline supervisor to be deeply engaged with that officer shows a lot of promise. So in our world, it has 3 components. So that supervisor needs to document no less than 5 supervisory ride-alongs a week with that officer. That supervisor needs to review and collectively put together a training plan for the officer that they're involved in. That supervisor needs to get notified anytime that officer gets an IA complaint or utilization of force, not from a punitive perspective, but to debrief what went well, what didn't go well, right? It's kind of pulling in that frontline supervision, those sergeants to be really, really engaged, or if need be, that lieutenant to be engaged with those sergeants. So however you think about this, again, from a policy perspective about your review, having a deliberate, systematic way to think about ways to support an officer when they're alerted in the early warning system that does not rely on internal affairs as the sole determinant of what happens is really, really important. And I would argue that in many cases, these things need to live outside of internal affairs. One, because IA has a full-time job to investigate incidents at the level. That certainly doesn't go away in this world, right? But there's all of these other layers of interventions that could be happening when an early warning system alerts that's there, including all of the positive things that should be happen. So we offer that it should be a research-based case management module for officer-specific interventions. Last slide. So almost done here. I'm probably over my 25 minutes. All right. I'm going to finish up here. Sorry, Madam Chair. The last thing I would say is that for good policy decisions to occur, we also strongly recommend that everything is a closed-loop system. So if you think about this world, in here, you're tracking and managing the data that manages. In here, you're identifying exceptional conduct and problematic or off-track conduct. In here, you're intervening, right? And because you have the underlying data here, you can understand, did the intervention alter the conduct that we wanted altered, in what way? And having that closed loop system and having a governance body to that closed loop system will allow a department to continually iterate their policy, to continually evolve their workforce over time and make them more and more effective. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to present today. There's a whole bunch of detail underneath what I talked about today that we'd be happy to share in any level of detail as the chair or any of the commissioners would wish today. But thanks for giving us the opportunity to present today.
Thank you, and I'm sure there are going to be many questions, so I don't know who has the first one. Quite, yes, Matthew?
First of all, thank you very much. Good presentation. I liked forward. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think so, just speak,
Can you hear me?
just, yes.
I've been watching the videos, and when they're not on, it's hard to hear. Great presentation, 4 slides. So here's my question to you or to somebody. I guess, why are you here today? So I understand what you presented, and it's helpful.
Yeah.
But do you have a contract with the city? Is this extra information just for us that was brought in for us? I don't know if I'm directing this at you or I'm looking at you.
We don't,
guys.
well, I can say we do not have any contract with the city of Columbus.
Okay.
We're here because this is the work that we do. We present to cities all across the country. We do contract with a lot of cities, but more than anything, I would say the reason that we chose to come here and the city was generous enough to invite us is we bring another perspective to the table. We do research on police-related personnel management issues, and so I would like to think we're here as just one more voice, right, at the table that could be helpful in all of you as you think about and reflect on your recommendations.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other, yes, Vlad?
I'd be curious to hear from Deputy Chief Quinlan how this compares kind of to what we do now, so we get a sense of, you know, what's similar, what's different.
Okay, actually today you're going to have a presentation from Commander Gray that's going to go over what we currently do today. We are looking at developing some of these other indicators into the system, but what we are doing currently is mostly the use of force and citizen complaints and having triggers. But Commander Gray is going to go over that for you.
I'm going to ask a question around a specific example you gave. So you were talking about community engagement, and it really, I guess the question is, how do you capture the citizen's perspective on that engagement? I'm assuming that in most cases, there's the single police officer, there is the citizen. So how does the department find out the citizen's view of that interaction?
Yeah. So there's lots of context for it. In some record management systems, either at the CAD, so when someone calls 911, they're more than often these days where well over 50% of inbound calls are cell phone, are coming in from a cell phone. So you have a cell phone, which then is a way to issue a survey, right? Because you have a cell phone number and cell phones have text, right? So you can follow up via text. Or if in that record management system, to the degree they're a victim of a crime, and in that record management system, in the criminal reporting, you're capturing an email address, it's another way to communicate. The way that I think about this is the same way that I think about community policing. And fundamentally, we've charged police departments across this country with community policing. But if we back up and say, what are the communication tools by which we want them to engage, right? I engage with my children by text all day. I do it work by email. I'm on the phone, right? We still communicate with police fundamentally by dialing 911, goes to a dispatcher who gets on the radio and sends a police officer to your location, right? And then you dial back 30 minutes later, you may or may not get the same officer depending on what other assignments they have. As we think about evolving community policing, we need fundamentally new communication tools similar to the ones that we use in our lives every day for the way that we communicate with everyone else. Those are wholly missing from this equation. And so to the degree that those same feedback tools that are used for everything else in life are used as mechanisms to gain feedback on interactions, it can be really powerful. But most of the folks, at least from an inbound, I've called 911 perspective, we have their information, we have their cell phones through those computer-aided dispatch systems. And those can be leveraged to gain one level of feedback.
Glad. I'm sorry, was there another hand? Emily, were you? Okay.
Just curious if, when you've been looking at the non-disciplinary, non-punitive approaches, if you've looked at some of the research that surrounds trauma-informed care.
You know, it's part of the work that we're doing, but it's pretty early. And so we are still cataloging, if you will, all of these interventions that have a research base behind them.
Because I think trauma-informed care would agree with you that discipline doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly believe that. We're building the research base to validate that.
And it also, I think, speaks to what you were talking about with the supervisor and the mentor and the power of relationships, then also goes back to that trauma-informed care piece. So to me, that's just connecting a lot of dots when you said that.
Yeah. Thank you, and I will double and triple check that trauma-informed care specifically is the things that we're engaged in when we look at that. Thank you.
Vlad?
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on kind of the suggestion of serving people. So this is kind of an area that I'm interested in studying, and is performance management. And two, I think, examples of this where it maybe goes wrong kind of make me think about the implications in this context. So in universities, we survey students and quality teaching, and we know that the best predictor is the grade they get. So the incentive is to give students high grades. And I think in Medicare, doctors are reimbursed partly based on satisfaction surveys from their patients. And we know that people give doctors higher satisfaction scores when they prescribe antibiotics for things like the cold, which we know is viral, it can't be cured. So there's all these kind of perverse incentives when the people you're interacting with aren't evaluating you based on the criteria we actually want to reward. So I'm curious whether, how officers respond to these incentives, what the research shows, what interactions are rewarded, and the downstream, maybe unintended consequences of that.
Yeah, so I'd say several things. One is I think how survey questions are designed are critically important, right? So this is not a, hey, 5 if you're super happy, 1 if you're super unhappy, right? That would not be a good survey question. It's to state the obvious. And I think the context of it matter, and the relative peer group answers for what one might expect matters a lot. And I think whether you're surveying a victim of a crime versus someone else also matters in terms of making those results thoughtful. The key is there needs to be a two-way, it needs to be 2 ways in terms of understanding and be able to get feedback on how folks feel. And so lots of work out there. What's driving this saying we need this other way to gather feedback, right, is this idea that where trust falls down is not necessarily because there's some terrible violation of policy, right? That's going to lead to a sustained complaint, right? But folks feel disrespected. I will tell you on a very personal level, when I was a police officer working the street in Chicago, right, there are two kinds of officers, right? And the bulk of the officers were incredibly exceptional, right? But we had but there were officers who I worked with who, whenever they finished that engagement, right, they weren't necessarily violating policy, but I got to tell you, whoever engaged with them felt pretty disrespected, right? And it made everyone else in the Chicago Police Department who I worked with, it made all of our jobs tougher. It created a adverse relationship between us and the community. And because folks are going to remember that one really negative encounter, right? And to the degree that we can add incremental data points to understand how how folks feel, right, from these interactions is going to help holistically inform how we train, how we support, how we ensure officers are engaged in a way that ensures everyone feels respected. And I used to say, like, literally, and I mean this very sincerely, like, two officers will both put their handcuffs on someone, right, in an arrest situation, right? One officer will leave that, everyone's walking away laughing and smiling. Maybe not the guy in handcuffs, but they fundamentally understand they're arrested, the gig is up, okay, and the officer's done what they needed to do, right? There are other situations where that exact same outcome occurs, but the interaction and the humanity of how people perceive that, right, will create a very damaging impact on how that individual talk inside their community about the police, how that community will feel about how they're being serviced by the police. And adding to that narrative with good feedback loops for everyone involved to collectively say there's got to be better ways to do this, I think is super important. And I think your point on performance evaluation is very critical, that it can't be used unilaterally as a single measure. It can't be used as a punitive measure, right? It needs to be used holistically as part of a feedback loop to help folks understand how their conduct is perceived, right? So that they can think about it differently and give folks a way where they feel heard, I think, holistically too, about what their experience has been like.
So I'm interested in your use or your research around non-disciplinary and non-punitive interventions. And how do you see that engendering trust in the community? Because we know that there's an emotional part of the engagement with the officer, but if it's a use of force incident, then we know that there's probably some physical interaction that could cause pain or even potential long-term injury. So when you say non-punitive and non-disciplinary, does that then say that to the uninformed, to the community, that there has been no punishment or that there will be no ongoing, retribution for the pain and the suffering that they have experienced? And how do you anticipate?
So we think about
explain-
this. That's a great question, and I would say this is somewhat of an and. So what we like to think about is I'm guessing, right? We've never seen an incident, nor do we advocate in any way to say, well, we're going to get rid of internal affairs, where if there's an allegation of wrongdoing, it gets investigated, and there's outcome, and the outcome of that does or does not lead to discipline, right? In the traditional disciplinary methodology, right? What we're saying is when you look at the world of early warning, right, and if it's a good early warning system, it's going to be helpful in identifying officers who are off track. Now, from an actual investigation to issue discipline, that's ongoing, right? But what are all of the other things in the interim that can be done to support that officer so that there's not that next incident? How do we get them to perform better, right? Now, I would advocate at some level that where you don't have a pattern, okay, of problematic conduct, and the key word is a pattern, right, then non-disciplinary is a great way to go, right? Because this officer doesn't have 9 complaints behind them, right? They might have had their first complaint in 4 years or 5 years, and the general interaction is very positive around that officer. I would even argue, I don't even know the merit of necessarily investigating that particular incident, where there might be other interventions that might ultimately lead to better conduct, right? I don't think any of us live in a world where if someone's, if there's an allegation where there's physical harm, that it's not going to get investigated and ultimately discipline will happen. So in many ways, it's an and, right? That world exists, that world's ongoing, but also, we haven't seen evidence that that world is really altering conduct. So what are other things we can be doing along with that, right, to support officers to ensure that they're as effective as they can be?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is your data, is it tracking breakdowns as far as incidents or things that happen in certain communities, such as an African American community, Hispanic, Caucasian, whether it be use of force, different things like that? Are you guys collecting data that specifies, such as, well, we see patterns that certain things happen in these communities more than others? Are you guys tracking on that level?
Yeah, we as an organization, so there's a research part of what we do, which is just research, and then we as an organization partner with cities and work with cities to determine what's all the data that they think is important, and then we help inform it with research. So I can't really answer that question directly as you're asking it, but we think geography matters a lot for peer group purposes, right? So what is someone's utilization of force in a geography, right? And geography very often will mirror, right? It might be a community that's more African American than others, more Hispanic than others, right? So in that geography, what do we look as the norm, right? And what does someone who's outside the norm look like, right? And what is the context then? Because the context matters to theoretically determine, is there an issue or is there not an issue?
Are there other questions?
With this approach being very, very holistic, how do you get officers and supervisors to buy in with no punitive, there's nothing, do you know what I mean, nothing disciplinary that happens? How do you get them to buy in?
Yeah. First of all, let me just be really clear about kind of what we're saying. Well, we're not saying that IA goes away, right? Or that we recommend that IA goes away or that discipline goes away. Those are long-term, collectively bargained things that are necessary, right? I would argue they're necessary. No one would feel there's justice if they don't make an allegation and someone investigates, right? So I'm not arguing that let's forget all of that, okay? What I am arguing to you, though, is that in a holistic perspective, almost like any other workforce in the world, right, there are things besides discipline that need to be a core part of how you engage someone to be better at their job. And when you have a pattern, right, as a matter of policy, I believe, a department should be engaged in identifying research-based practices that, when an officer is off track, helps them get better without being punitive, without being disciplinary, right? So if there's a investigation on an allegation and it comes back sustained, right, there's very likely to be discipline, right, whatever that might be. But independent of that, if that is the only instrument to make someone be more effective at their job, we haven't seen evidence that's effective. And by the way, that's what every police department in America does, right? The instrument of improved behavior is an allegation comes in, an allegation is investigated, an allegation is sustained or not sustained, it could be exonerated, but whatever the classification, to the degree that it's found to be a justified investigation, some level of discipline is issued, right? And in most places we work, it's an 18-month window from the moment the allegation occurs until the back end. What's that? Or more, right? It's a very long window of time, right? Think about during that whole window of time, let's say someone has 3 IA investigations, and they're all being investigated, right? It's a really long time to not otherwise positively intervene to help that officer be better so they don't get the 4th, 5th, and 6th. And that is what we think is really important.
Can you give an example? Can you give an example, I guess, of how that works? I'm thinking counseling memo, performance improvement plan, non-disciplinary examples that I'm aware of that most people consider discipline. Even though they're not on the discipline track, people will consider them discipline. And like Emily said, it doesn't work, right? It's not effective. So what are some of the examples that you're looking at that are productive and, positive for the officers that are non-disciplinary discipline?
Yeah. The mentorship is, I'm going to just go back to that one because it's, I think it's one that's particularly compelling, a very structured mentorship, right? That builds a relationship between that supervisor and that officer, all around hey, what is incremental training that we think will be helpful to you, right? I'm going to go show up at least 5 or 10 of your calls this week, right? And after those calls, we're not going to document it, but let's debrief. Hey, what went really well about that call? What could have gone better, right? When that officer uses force, I, as that supervisor, get notified so that I can debrief positively with that officer, right? That would be an example from a structured perspective that, hey, if you appear to have this pattern of issues, right, let's not add an investigation, but let's figure out what are layers in here that we can layer in, right? Maybe the first layer is mentorship. Maybe a second layer is some great incremental training that is specific to the area that we see that you're struggling in. And that culturally, if you think about how much I have is this closed loop, is you work towards, and none of this is easy and none of this is fast, you work towards this culture where folks are all helping each other be better at the craft of policing. Policing is really hard work. It's really complicated. Everyone brings their own style to it. And fundamentally, without the self-reflection of your peers, let me state this differently. I've not found it to be the norm in police departments where people are giving each other thoughtful, constructive criticism about how to be really good at what they do. And any job in the world where you don't get thoughtful, non-defensive feedback on how to be better, right, means you're not likely to improve that much because you're relying on your own self-reflection of how you get better. So what are those kinds of systems that allow you to get thoughtful feedback to be better at your craft? And so many of the things that we're researching that we see work are things that help provide really thoughtful feedback so that someone can think about how to be better at their job. And those things don't involve discipline, or don't have to.
Stay with the subject of mentoring. I mean, I certainly get that concept. And I don't know if you've looked at staffing levels as a part of when you look at cities. So the first premise has to be that a sergeant has to have enough time to become sort of actively involved with the officers that are on his shift. Rather than being engaged in administrative work or some other things. So have you seen it as an issue in departments where that sergeant may really want to do that, but because of lack of civilian support or whatever, he or she can't because they have these other things they must do?
Yeah, I think all of these things need to have their own structured time. And that can be a challenge, right? And so I think it's super relevant, Chair. I think structured time on these personnel matters matter a lot.
So how do you take into account culture of an entire organization? Like the entire force has a culture. So you get in this feedback loop an early warning indicator that says that a person needs an intervention. But then I'm the sergeant. I go out with my guy. I go, I would have done the same thing. But this is part of the process. So we got to ride along for a few times. And then after that, whatever. You do what you do, right? So how does analytics account for culture and the human aspect of police work?
What I'm going to give you, my opinion is nothing substitutes for leadership, right? So I don't think we can pretend that with the absence of leadership, data and analytics is this transformative tool, right? These things all have to be married up, right? And in any organization, there will be people who are not on board and there will be people who are on board. So this doesn't solve for what you're describing, right? But what I think chips away at culture, and by the way, I'm not making any judgment call on the Columbus Police Department, right? Because I don't know the Columbus Police Department. I've had tremendously wonderful interactions everywhere I've had with the Columbus Police. But it's just as a rule of culture in general, right? What I would argue the data should tell you are who are the officers that need to be lifted up, right? And if I use the example that I had, those officers who are incredibly good at de-escalation, right? That are the ones that are at the top 10% for relative to the work they're doing are involved in de-escalation are probably a really great group to recognize and raise up as this is the conduct that we think is really fantastic, right? Equally important, those officers who are off track and struggling, right? To the degree that there is an organizational structured way where those officers are being intervened and supported to get better, begins to play at the ends of a culture, right? I think that what I find in a lot of police departments is those exceptional officers who are doing a great job every day are engaging folks respectfully, are not shying away from good crime fighting, are doing what maybe all of us would in a round room say, that's tremendously great conduct, right? What are we doing to reward those officers? What are we doing from a promotional process to say, great, to be qualified for promotion, this is the general pattern of conduct that we want to see, right? Because over an extended period of time, raising up those folks, right, will lead to improved cultures, right? Because they're the folks who are demonstrating day in, day out the conduct that we want to see. That to me begins to get at many of these fundamental issues.
Can I just add something?
Yeah, sorry, sir. Jump in.
Not any particularly different point, but just to kind of restate, folks who are doing a tremendous job and maybe falling between the cracks a little bit aren't being, as Ron said, risen up, aren't quite as obvious, and folks who are struggling and falling, between the cracks maybe a little bit that way, that problem thrives in a scenario in which you have extremely siloed data and information, because it's nearly impossible to find any of those folks in this system. So you mentioned the closed loop. I mean, that's really what we're talking about when we focus on that issue.
Great point. Thanks, sir.
When you're talking about like the leadership and being able to mentor other people, also addressing what Olitha, brought up about supervisors and the culture, wouldn't it be better if you had this officer that's performing really well at de-escalation and domestic violence, be the person that the officer that needs the training mentor them? Say, I'm going to have you ride with this officer for the next couple of weeks because they're showing that they're really good at de-escalation, and I think you would be well-served to get some training from them and learn from their experiences, rather than a supervisor saying, I'm going to ride along with you for the next 5 days. That supervisor may not even know the best uses of de-escalation themselves.
Exactly. I think it's a fundamental point. I was giving an example, right? And when I say let's raise up officers, that whatever the metric is, right? Force is its own metric, is not, it's got to be holistic, right? By raising those folks up, your point is exactly on, right? Should those be the folks who are training at the training academy, right? Should those be the folks who are engaged in partnering up with folks who are struggling? Those are all of the key questions. Having been a school superintendent, I'm going to not be able to help myself. But in the school environment, when we see schools thrive, right, we see teachers do the equivalent of medical rounds. They walk into each other's classes. They collaboratively do observation, right? You end up with teachers who are excelling in certain areas, and they end up being coaches and mentors to other teachers to help them in areas when they're utilizing data particularly. In the world of education, what the research would suggest is everywhere that occurs, you have dramatically better student outcomes. You have higher retention rates amongst teachers because they feel supported in the work that they do. And you get better retention in school. And we saw that in the Chicago public school system. So if you just think about that, I would say the same thing applies in policing in many ways, right? To the degree that someone's struggling out there and someone who's really good in the area that they're struggling, and there is a way to understand that, who's good at that, not what you think intuitively, but the data is screaming at you that, hey, take a look at this. It provides for really, really thoughtful, nuanced, individualized support of that officer that is, I would argue, very likely to lead to much better outcomes in every single metric that we see.
Jurisdictions that you've implemented, sure, in jurisdictions that you've implemented, do you find that this technology supplements, and therefore you have to integrate with Hexagon, Premier One, HR databases, or does it supplant, and we're replacing those HR databases, for example, with this technology?
Yeah. What we find is the average department that we partner with is shutting off 4 to 7 people systems. Meaning some departments are utilizing, here's what we find, right? in our context. It's why we built One Enterprise to this, and part of that's from the 21st Century Commission on how we think about this data, right? But typically, training is a standalone system. And when I say system, I'm being really generous. Departments have an access database, they've got, right? Training's its own system. Activity lives in the CAD RMS, and it's very hard to get peer data out of, so it's got to be pulled out to be analyzed. Use of force and IA sometimes are the same system, sometimes they're the different, or they're not particularly reporting friendly, but that's a different system. Community engagement usually doesn't exist, meaning there's not a measurement tool for that in the lexicon that's there. And more often than not, performance evaluation came from city government and is trying to be applied inside the policing context. And those are just some of the system. And then officer profile is elsewhere, right? So also kind of the feedback loop of what should we be recruiting in terms of our next generation, because we're learning the feedback loop that when we recruit certain kinds of folks who have certain backgrounds relative, that's to education, the community they've come from, they're more, all of that is all in different locations. And building off of Sarah's point, when all of these things are siloed, it is almost impossible to be able to tell the narrative of what the commissioner was bringing up, hey, this person's really good at de-escalation. Because it becomes this just kind of almost impossible data integration analysis story when it's all separated.
So the answer is supplanting, not.
Yes, yes.
Well, Ron and Sarah, we want to thank you for coming and sharing today. I think we've all found this to be informative and very interesting. Absolutely not sure how it will inform our work, but we're absolutely appreciative of the fact that you came and being so open with us today. So thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
And it's now time to take a break. You were scheduled for 10, let's make it 15, but please be back in your chairs by 4 o'clock so we can start the next section on time. Thank you. And we're going to change the agenda. We're going to have Commander Mike Gray come forward and share with us around the Employee Action Review System. Welcome. It's for recording.
Thank you. As they said, my name is Mike Gray. I'm a commander with the division, currently Crimes Against Persons, and I've been the chairperson of the EARS Committee for 6 years now. This will be my last cycle. Commander Meter from training will be taking over for me first of the year, but I'd like to give you kind of an overview of what we do after you just heard, the proposal of how they like to see things done. You'll see some things we are doing, some things we aren't doing. Some of the purposes, obviously, is to correct future behavior, try to find patterns in individual officers to try to prevent that from happening in the future. Obviously, bring it to supervisors' attention if there's potential issues so that they can be more involved. And to help, the kind of a side effect of it is helping defend against custom and practice lawsuits. Again, like I talked about, we like to talk about risk factors and different things, which I'm going to go over the triggers and things that we actually look for. And obviously, a lot of what we find is kind of collective. We may be looking at a group of different officers and we see similar things, which makes us think, well, how are we training? In which case we refer to the training bureau to say, hey, how are we, in defensive tactics, for instance, how are you training the resistor who locks his arms under his head? Because we see, a lot of certain uses of force. So there are other ways, how are we training officers to respond to this? You'll see the positive corrective action. This is not a punitive by any stretch of the way, nor can anyone be disciplined for anything we find. We are looking at investigations that are already done and adjudicated. A lot of them, discipline has been issued in them, so there's no sense in issuing it again. It is purely a predictive program, again, trying to head things off at the pass, if at all possible. And obviously, career longevity, for the officer, we want them to be able to retire from here and keep them from going down a path maybe they shouldn't be going. Okay, so obviously we get most of our stuff from the records, and the place we get most of our records from is this Premier One. It is kind of our system that we have put most of our records in, especially most of the records that we look at for the purposes of the EARS committee. And some of the things, these are all different things that we can collect in that program. The biggest things we look at are citizen complaints, uses of force, uses of mace. However, the potential to look at other things is also in there. We were just approved to add the category of injury to prisoners, which is where a prisoner gets injured during the course of an arrest or an incident, but it wasn't due to force by the officer. We obviously investigate those to make sure that there was no force used and also to determine if there was negligence on the part of the officer. So those are going to be added as a trigger in subsequent exams. Discharge firearms only if they're discharged at a person. Accidental discharges aren't included in there. They are under, because they are a use of force. It's the ultimate on the continuum. Again, as you can see, this is mostly just investigative things that we've already looked at. That's pretty much what we currently are looking at. We definitely are looking at options to change that and make more HR triggers brought in as well.
What about rudeness?
That would be a citizen complaint. Yep. Those, and as I'm sure you guys all know, any complaint, no matter how minor, is investigated by Internal Affairs. So they will investigate rudeness complaints, and we refer people for rudeness complaints quite a bit if we see a pattern of multiple complaints. Okay, so what we do is that Sergeant Welday, typically, he was the sergeant in IA when we first started pulling this data out. Every 6 months, the committee meets, spring and fall, and we look at the 12-month cycle, which moves every 6 months with us. And to get us more modern, we've been doing 15-month cycles, so we've been picking up more officers, more investigations. But and they'll pull the top 5% of uses of force, uses of mace, and citizen complaints. So typically for citizen complaints, it's going to be at least 3. The minimum will be 3 complaints. And then typically use of force and mace, but it's whatever person, like the person who had the highest may have had 8 uses of mace. You know, maybe they work a lot of special duty at the Park Street Bar District on Friday and Saturday nights where they're constantly breaking up fights. You know, they're going to be represented on there, but they go down pretty much to everybody has at least 3. So Internal Affairs generates the report. And it comes to the committee. They put it in a nice little booklet, and then we get a CD with all of the investigations, everything that's been scanned in by Internal Affairs. And then I submit it to all the members on the committee, and I'll show you the breakup here shortly. And so they're responsible for reviewing all these investigations, reading them, and then we divvy up the presentation duties of, you know, explaining it, and then we discuss each one of the officers collectively with their investigations. Here's what it currently looks like. You have myself, I'm the chair, but I have no vote in this at all. There's a training bureau representative always available if we have questions, especially use of force questions, or the DTU person's always around. We have 2 lieutenants, and in fact, we were at 3 or 4 lieutenants because people kept getting promoted off this committee. This committee probably has the highest percentage of people that get promoted of anyone in the division, because we don't make people serve on this committee. They volunteer because they actually, you know, want to be involved, and they actually want to help officers help themselves, and, you know, they volunteer. So people like that tend to be FTOs, you know, field training officers, people that are trying to get promoted, you know, that have a strong presence in the division. And they tend to be very well respected in the division as well. So we have the 20 members. You've got 16 officers, or what is it, 12 officers, I think 2 sergeants, 2 lieutenants, however it breaks down. It's mostly officers. And what we do is we try to get someone from every shift and then someone from every zone is the goal. Of course, since it's volunteer, sometimes we may not have one in one zone or another, but that's not absolutely necessary. And we have 2 alternates, which can be a sergeant or an officer. And right now, yes, sir.
Who breaks the tie?
Breaks the tie? We've never had a tie.
Okay.
But you know what? Now that you've said that, I'll say me. Even though I'm not a voting member. Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, we've never had that come up. Anyways, let's move on. Okay, to be on the committee, you have to obviously be sworn. You have to be an officer or supervisor. It has to be voluntary. We can't take anyone from internal affairs or professional standards. And you have to have at least 3 years on the department, and if you've been promoted 1 year in grade at your current rank. Can't have any departmental charges filed within the last 4 years. And you can't be under investigation at the time you apply and are appointed to the committee. And you can't have a sustained allegation from a complaint or an outside use of force in the last 3 years. When we take applications, for instance, I'm taking applications now, because we basically have 18 members that rotate. So, and it's a 3-year term they consent to serve. So every year, 6 members drop off, and we add 6 new members, and then we just keep rotating it that way. So the same people do not stay on there. Although I think I've drafted Lieutenant Lip to fill a vacancy at one point, so I think he's been there a while. Okay, and I've already, yes, ma'am.
Sorry. What's the demographic of the current committee? Like, how many are women? How racially diverse is it?
I can look at my email. I have to look at the email list of when I just sent them, and I can go over it for you. Okay. If you don't mind reading
Yes,
off the phone.
I'm fine with that as long as everyone else is.
Okay. Let's see here. Male. Now, can we edit out the downtime? Okay, here we go. Okay, let's see, we have 1, 2. We have 2 black officers, 1 male, 1 female. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 5 female officers, and the rest are male whites.
Thank you.
Sure. Again, here, we kind of went over this. These are the triggers that we have, and we will also do what we call a multiple category. So maybe the trigger for complaints is at least 3. Well, maybe they have 2 complaints, but they also have 2 uses of mace, that are unrelated. So if that's the case, we will consider that meeting the threshold as well, and they will be reviewed in that category for the collectively. And kind of, I don't know that there's a reason for it, but it seems like that category, the multiple, tends to be the one we refer more people out of, even though in each category they may have fewer than some. Okay, here's some of the things. This is right from the SOP of the different things that the committee's supposed to be looking for when they review these investigations. Obviously, similar behaviors is the biggest one that stands out when you read them. But, also, they talk about unit behavior, or there's certain officers that are only getting complaints when they're working with certain other officers. That's something they look at. Pretty much just anything that looks similar. And like he had discussed earlier, for the triggers, let's say you have 3 citizen complaints, and they're all for rudeness, which we have one in the last couple of years we referred. All of them were either unfounded or not sustained. None of them were sustained. But to us, that was still a pattern. There's 3 people that are picking up a phone and filing a complaint. So that would be somebody we would refer, all things being equal. Unless we have body camera footage that shows clearly 3 times it did not happen. And the body camera footage is really, this last cycle was the first time we had a lot of people that actually had them, so we have the ability to go and look at the camera and look at the interaction and say, okay, I guess this is a clear unfounded. So if we do vote, let's say we have the person with the 3 complaints, they take a vote. And they tend to, we've only had a couple that were fairly contested, in all honesty. And I'll say this about the committee. You know, as I read the investigations beforehand and kind of make my notes on who I think might be referred, they always probably find one or two that I didn't even pick up on. So let's say we would refer them. Now, if we looked at you but didn't refer you, I send them an email saying you were reviewed for your complaints, uses of force, whatever it is. However, there's no pattern at this time, just so they know that we actually looked at their investigations and that they were reviewed. If we did perceive a pattern, we're going to put it to a vote. And if they are, a tie vote, actually, to answer your question, a tie vote sends it in. So I guess I won't be making the call. We'll write up a form. Is that my time? Am I up? That's okay. You've already heard the best. Okay, so what happens is there's a form I fill out where we list all the investigations we looked at, and we type in, I type in exactly what the concerns were. And the concerns, I thought I'd just go back our last couple of years, some of the officers we referred, just give you an idea of some of the things that we have referred for. So I actually did some homework. One of the things we noticed was, like, on some uses of mace, an officer had 4 different investigations, but each one it was like they copied and pasted and just changed the date, which could be just being lazy and not being, but if you're doing that, you're probably not putting as much detail in your narrative as you probably should be, so that's something we refer them back to. We refer a lot of officers for tactics, unsafe tactics, being unsafe. For instance, an officer comes across, like, at least twice, one officer in this review period came across somebody who was armed, a gun in their waistband, and instead of holding him at gunpoint waiting for backup, they go to engage him one-on-one to make the arrest. We don't want them doing that. You pick up a mic, trust me, we can get somebody to you pretty quick. It's just safer for everybody. We had another officer, he had 3 uses of force in the review period, and every one of them, when he was going to arrest somebody during the handcuffing process, they got away and forced him to chase them down, and then we have a use of force that we really shouldn't have had if better prisoner control would have been used. We have a lot of in our opinion, poor judgment referrals. Officers making bad decisions to make arrests and get involved in things that they probably shouldn't have. We have, like, for instance, we had one person on 3 traffic stops, did not do a very good job on documentation, and did not do the data collection form that they were maintaining on all 3. So that officer was referred. So that's just an idea of some of what we refer them to. So once the referral is done, I will give it to the deputy chief, and they'll send it down the chain of command, and they basically review it, and they determine whether they believe there's a pattern, and they can fill out a form, which I've got copies of, maybe would like to see it. It's just called a sworn ears plan. It's kind of a performance improvement plan, basically, where they analyze it, and then they set up, hey, how are we going to address this to prevent anything negative in the future from happening? So when they get it, they're gonna ask themselves these questions here. Basically, they're asking the same questions that the committee asked. Are there patterns here? Is there anything related? Hopefully, they're going to ask, being their chain of command and their immediate supervisors, is there something going on in their personal life? Is there something outside going on? And they're going to know the officer better than us. But the nice thing about having such a wide net of zones and shifts in the EARS committee is somebody knows these officers, and they'll give you the lowdown. Like, they may be like, oh yeah, I know he was going through a divorce at this time, or something else that the chain of command might need to know about to try to intervene. We have a lot of options, obviously with that the chain of command can refer to with EAP. Our peer assistance team is very popular. It's very well considered, and I know a lot of officers who have actually availed themselves to it. So basically, those are some of the questions, but that's just a real generality to give you an idea.
Commander, we have yet to go over, it's at a future session, the EAP and your group, just speak to each one of those briefly.
Okay, EAP is the Employee Assistance Program. Lisa Callender is the head of it. She's awesome sauce. She works out of Department of Health, and it's basically, oh, sorry. Strike that from the record. And it's basically an employee wellness program. You know, if you're going through some hard times or your family member or something is, you can reach out to them, and she has other counselors. They also will refer out if that's appropriate. They can do everything from marriage counseling to helping your children. And it's just a great benefit that people who work for the city have. And then the peer assistance team, I believe, Commander Bachert, weren't you involved in creating that? Yeah, it is. It serves a similar function. You know, a lot of time, cops only want to talk to other cops. And it is a group of police officers who all have their own strong backgrounds and have been through their various trials of life. And they volunteer to serve on this team. And it's a totally anonymous, there's a list of everyone on there. And if I want to pick up the phone because I'm having a problem, I can look down and say, you know, I know Greg is 100% confidential. I can call him and go, and as long as I'm not telling him I'm going to do something crazy, it's just between Greg and I. No one knows. No one else on the team's even going to know that I came to him. And it's been really great. In fact, being in Crimes Against Persons, we had Lisa Callender come and talk to our various shifts with her people and with PAT. Just, you know, people see in those units, you know, you've got crime scene people that are constantly seeing, you know, victims of violence and the homicide going out and, you know, the violent things. So we just want to let them know, hey, here's things to keep healthy, functioning people healthy and functioning. And as she pointed out in a meeting, there's never been one allegation of a breach of confidentiality come from the PAT, which is amazing, really, because there have been hundreds of people who've availed themselves to it. So. And I don't know if you'll be hearing more from them, but.
In the future.
Okay, sorry about that. Spoiler. But again, here's some of the things that are available. Again, the psychologist, the EAP. Admin transfer, not so much. Back in the day, the contract was a little stronger. You could much easier move people to an assignment that would be more, I don't know, apt for them. For instance, if you have someone who can't seem to get to work on time or whatever, it might be better that they be in a regimented patrol location but we don't do that so much anymore. But again, the peer counseling would be like peer assistance. Sometimes it's just something they need training, like the officer who every time he'd go to cuff somebody, they're getting away from him. That's something a defensive tactic unit could probably address him to make a more safe handcuffing and make it quicker and avoid any issues. Technical skills development program, you know, if they're having problems writing report, they can do that. I know a lot of stuff gets kicked back to poor Commander Meter and training there, but they're stellar, they get it done. Sometimes even the sergeant may decide, hey, I'm gonna start riding with you once a week. You know, I'm gonna go out, let you do your thing, and let's see how you interact with people or whatever the issue is. And again, the great thing with the body cameras now and the CVS is they can go back any time and look and just check out interactions in general and make sure.
What's CVS?
Oh, cruiser video system. It was the precursor. It was what we had before the body cameras, and we still have some of them in effect. But the body cameras are everywhere. Whereas if it didn't happen in front of the cruiser, you're not going to see it. Okay, this basically just shows, once the form is done, for instance, I send one to Chief Quinlan, they come up with a performance plan, it's done. The original goes in the personnel file of the involved officer, and then myself as the chair, I get a copy, and I just put it in. I keep folders for every cycle, and I just keep the copy in there. It goes nowhere else. So some of the problems with having this is, you know, obviously, you know, I thought this would be more of a problem, actually, when I first came in there. You know, we're sitting there kind of second-guessing other officers, you know, well, what could they have done better? It's a lot easier to do that sitting around a room like we do here and as we discuss them as a committee. But it's they have no problem doing it. I mean, because they know in the end it's for the best. And again, I think that's a function of us appointing people that are committed to making this better on the committee. Conflict isn't something you like. A lot of the members have told me, hey, why did you guys refer me? And they're like, well, why are you keep doing this? Maybe, there's a way to get off of this. Because it is not negative. Now, a lot of officers, they really think, oh, if I got reviewed by ears, then I'm doing something wrong, and that's simply not the case. No matter how many times we tell them this is not punitive, we're not trying to get you, this is not disciplinary and cannot contractually be disciplinary, a lot of times they're reluctant to believe that. And I'll tell you another challenge we have, which he kind of hit on the head, is there are a lot more triggers we would like to review, the HR triggers, maybe sick mark-offs, absent without leave, administrative investigations, are they coming to work late, things like that. And right now, HR is kind of has its own stuff, and a lot of them are not even in one database. We've met with them on different occasions, and they've expressed that they would love to help us try to figure something out. I don't know how it would look. Maybe like we continue monitoring our P1, the administrative stuff, and meanwhile HR maybe generates, runs reports and possibly sends things just to the chain of command independent of this committee. But the more triggers you have, the more you're going to find. Another shortcoming I didn't have up there, though, is because we're looking at complaints and force, those patrol overwhelmingly tends to be the ones who get more complaints because they have a lot more contact with the public, and they tend to have a lot more use of force because investigative people, like my detectives, I don't know that I've seen a use of force unless they work special duty at a place where sometime they might have to. So for that reason, we pick up, we're only really getting a look at patrol people. And by adding some of these HR or admin triggers, I think that would give us a better ability to look at the division overall. But again, that's something that's being looked at. I'm sure Commander Meter will have that all fixed when he takes over the first of the year, if not sooner. Let's see, some of the impact, the goals that we'd like to see are reduced complaints. And I think complaints do go down, have been down considerably over the years. I don't know the numbers. I'm not saying it's a result of this committee, but that was one of the things that, the chief had wanted to see when we implemented this years ago. You want to reduce use of force if at all possible. Basically send a word out to supervisors, hey, spend a little more time with your people if you can. And I know our sergeants are buried. They work very hard. They have a lot of tasks to do. Their admin. They'd like to be out taking more runs, I think. But there are just times they just don't have that ability, and we understand that. Again, we want effective, functioning employees that remain that way. Obviously, like to see it enhance who we are as an agency, to say, hey, look, they're trying to do something. They're going forward. They're trying to find problems before they become problems. And with that, you were spared. That is all I have, unless anyone has any questions. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry, she called you. Sorry.
How much of a root cause analysis do you do on the individual employee when you review the complaint or the situation?
We probably don't do as much of a root cause analysis as the chain of command will do once they're reviewed, because they know this person, they've worked for them for a while. They may know what's going on in their life personally, whereas we probably don't unless there's a coworker on the committee. Again, we're mostly just looking for the patterns, but when it gets to them, that's when the chain of command kind of digs down and says, okay, what's going on here, and what's going to make, help this officer not get involved in these situations anymore.
Okay. And then my follow-up to that is, when you're looking at these events, do you also do a trend analysis to determine, are these behaviors specific to a shift or a precinct or a particular supervisor, and if so, what do you do with that?
Yeah, we would do that. For instance, if we see multiple officers on a single shift in precinct, that would be something we would refer. We would refer the whole unit. we have that ability. I don't know that we've seen that since I've been in there, but I know it's been done. Chief?
One thing we do see that we picked out in trend analysis is individuals that are fairly senior, but they all work a certain bar on special duty. We see a high number of incidents there, so that would generate that type of a review on people, and whether we need to add more officers there, require they have more officers, or that maybe we provide officers tasers, because right now we don't for working special duty. So those are the type of things we do look at.
Do you also get the officer input in that type of corrective action?
Okay, the action review plan that we create actually goes down through the chain of command. First of all, just real quick, Commander Gray comes to the executive staff, the chief and the deputy chiefs, and Commander Weiner in professional standards, and he presents the EARS committee findings. So the chief and all the deputy chiefs are informed of what was looked at and what the trends are and what's going on. Then each individual deputy chief sends it down to their sergeant over the officer and tells them to develop a plan. They develop a plan, it comes back to the deputy chief. I have to approve the plan, say, yeah, that's what we're gonna do. Or do this, but also do these things too. Then I send it back down, the officer signs off, and then the plan's in effect.
Do you find that that process works?
It works to the degree that there are certain areas, like Commander Gray said, that we're maybe missing. Why people are marking off sick or come to work late or have other type of administrative investigations. So there are things that we would like to include in there. One thing I will add real quick is if you think about an officer that works a precinct, let's just say on a really conservative side, they handle 5 runs a day. That's not very much an 8-hour shift. Let's say they just go to 5 runs a day. They work 200 days a year. That's 1,000 encounters with the public they have, each individual officer. It only takes 3 to trigger a review in the EARS committee of their activity. So they're getting looked at, with just a mere 3 out of 1,000 incidents. So it is pretty, I think, forward-looking.
Two questions for you. First one, when you said they volunteer in the committee, I assume they're still being paid. They're being paid as officers who are on the committee?
Yeah, they don't get anything extra.
Okay.
And if they're not on that shift, which we generally meet on first shift, then they change their duty hours that day to work first shift.
Okay, thank you. And the second question on, you don't have whatever slide number this one is?
Okay.
The chart. So just for clarification, these things go to EARS, and then they can be referred to IA and then to the EARS committee? Or do they go to IA and then EARS? A few more back. I'll tell you when to stop.
This one?
Nope. I think you're going the wrong way. One more. There you go.
Boom. Okay.
Okay, so it says procedures, EARS committee review,
Right.
but there's not an arrow to IA. So I'm just,
No, and actually,
where does it start?
it's generated in IA. They generate the report and get us the investigations, and they give it. Actually, I could have just said that without putting this confusing slide in there, probably.
Okay, I like the vision.
Yeah, but it was actually already in this canned PowerPoint that I kind of just made my own. So,
good.
and it looked good to have visuals because.
So it.
But now
so
it's
it goes
cat's out of the bag.
IA and then EARS every time. It doesn't go EARS, IA, EARS.
No, once it leaves IA, the stuff doesn't come back to IA.
Okay.
Yeah, they just generate the data for us.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Leave your microphones on, I think, just keep the green light on. And then when you start speaking, sometimes it sounds as if it's not on, but once you speak into it, the volume will come up. I think, yes. Leave your mics on, little green lights, all the time, and, because they're controlling it from back there, okay? So you have to speak a little bit more. Yes, Mary?
So coming off the benchmark presentation, is there anything that's actually tracking the positives? So the police officers that are doing a really effective job, say at de-escalation or something like that. Is there a trigger for those or any kind of tracking for that?
There's not a trigger or anything. I know the chief likes to hear implores the supervisors when you see a positive de-escalation technique to send it up to her. I think they put it out a lot on social media with our PIO office. They do a lot of that, but we don't have like that as a trigger per se. Back in the old days, like, when I was actually young, we had incident interview, and it could be good or bad. So it could be like, hey, you messed up on this report, or it could be, hey, you did a really good job on this arrest. But we don't have that anymore. We just have the progressive discipline steps. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's something that the chief would love to have more tracked a little better, because that's one of the things we like to see. How are we doing in this regard? And if you see where you're successful, that helps your training to adapt. So.
Mayor, in addition to that, we also have many awards that we give, but we also have other opportunities to send out manners that we send out, and on a positive note, we're always giving positive feedback every time we can to an officer, and we're actually actively seeking opportunities to let people know, model that behavior, and let them know the chief believes, and you get more of what you reward. So that's what we do. In fact, 6 o'clock tonight, I'm going to campus walking crew to deliver an award to 4 officers who got on a CODA bus with a guy with a machete threatening to kill the driver, and they were able to de-escalate, use no force, and take him into custody.
Sean, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, so a couple questions. One, I wasn't clear on what's the lifetime of serving on the EARS committee? Is it like the Supreme Court that you
No.
always wanted, or
Lucky for me, it's 3 years.
so it's a 3-year
Yes,
appointment,
a 3-year
voluntary
appointment.
appointment?
Mhm.
Okay. So that was one question. Then the second question is, I have 3 total. Is there a strategy, because we're recognizing, or at least how you characterized it, is that it kind of can help accelerate your career or create at least a promotion path for you? Is there a strategy for promoting that understanding and then increasing the diversity of the committee?
There is among the members. I mean, they are the ones who go out and try to recruit all-stars to join. We still have a hard time getting people to put in for it.
Yeah.
To be honest, I think I only have 5 applications. I have 6 vacancies.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's tough, and maybe, I'm not really sure why. Maybe just some of these younger officers coming in. It's a generational thing.
Is it prejudicial to serve on this committee because you're seen as reviewing your peers?
Based on the people who are on the committee, I would say probably not, because they're well regarded by other officers. But, a lot of people see it in general, like, well, I don't want to be part of that because, I'm, it's, just reviewing people and second guessing people. Well, it's kind of hard to change the mindset, but, when you see the people who are on the committee and they go out and they try to recruit, that's all we can do.
And then the last question is it in the contract that only sworn employees can serve on this committee?
I don't think that's contractual. I believe that's by directive.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Are there other questions? Then thank you. Yes, Yvonne? Yeah.
Sean, I had the same question. So I guess the follow-up to that is, what's the purpose of only having sworn employees and keeping it there, instead of having an outside perspective, much like the commission, serving on the EARS committee?
You mean from outside the division?
Yeah, so to your point, right, like officers don't want to be on the recommendation for discipline for other officers. Why not have other non-sworn persons, whether in the division or outside the division, almost as a third party, be a part of that review system?
I'd say probably the biggest reason would be someone who has not done the job and had the training, especially if you're looking at complaints would be a little easier, but like uses of force, somebody who doesn't know Graham versus Connor and the rules that we have to abide by with uses of force, they may look, oh my gosh, that shouldn't be in policy, or they may not understand it enough. Now, I mean, I'm sure there's some people that probably would, but it's just nothing that's ever been discussed, quite frankly.
Okay. It's, we see it across the nation. There's concern in some areas. I'm not recommending or suggesting an all non-sworn. I was just thinking 2 or 3 members, something to that. Why has that not been But you answered my question.
Okay. Are you volunteering?
Around the table, we are all volunteers, sitting, I mean, the commissions are all volunteers, sitting here. Sarah Tracy, our sworn personnel, thank you, always volunteering to be here. Yeah, I mean, why not take advantage of the citizens who can be a part of that? If it's a vote, it has to be a majority vote. I'm not asking for 8 non-sworn persons to be there. I'm not asking for anything, I'm just bringing it up.
Okay.
For your presentation.
That's it's a fair question.
Okay, and you said it's directive, so is that directive from public safety or from the chief's
The division of
office?
police, yeah, the chief has the ultimate say over the directives.
Okay,
But,
cool, thanks, sir.
yes, sir.
Did you have another question?
I was going to just interject something that I think Matthew already kind of clarified, in that it wouldn't skew necessarily the voting number, but it would bring another lens into the conversation. And I think ultimately the impetus for my question was about civilian staff who have a significant role already in the agency or in the division, having a voice at the table. When it comes to these types of reviews. In many ways, they have such a critical role at the start of the process because we've been kind of knee-deep in the hiring stuff. It would make sense that maybe they have a voice in the review of certain incidences as well.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Then, Commander, we want to thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for this incredible PowerPoint that you presented.
I look forward to coming back.
And I think he's back here behind me. Commander Boddicker?
Yes, ma'am.
There you are. Thank you.
Side of the.
Well, yeah, I was just gonna add and update it, but that's okay. You're taller than me, you can probably see it better than me. Thank you very much. I hope I don't share the computer there, huh? Thank you very much. Perfect. Do I want? I think so. I'll tell you as we go along. We ready to start?
Yes, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Greg Bodker. I'm the commander with the Columbus Division of Police Internal Affairs Bureau. Thank you, Chairperson Jackson, Director Speaks, for inviting me here, and thank you all for taking time out of your personal schedules, your professional lives, to learn intimately about our division. I'm going to talk today, and not used to standing still, I might even take this out. I won't sing, I won't tell jokes, I'm not as comical as Commander Gray. I'm going to give you really the 50,000-foot view of Internal Affairs Bureau. Jeff Furby asked me how long I plan to speak, and I could really, as we go along, you'll see I could talk for 2 hours, 8 hours, or half an hour, whatever you prefer. I urge you, as I go through this presentation, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. We are transparent. I will do the best job that I can to answer your questions, and if I cannot answer them today, I brought a lot of analyses and a lot of reports. If I don't know the answer off the top of my head, hopefully I can refer to these and find the answer for you. Our Internal Affairs Bureau. Let's see. Let's move this back here if I can. You guys good with that? What is our Internal Affairs Bureau? So when I took over in the Internal Affairs Bureau in February of 2017, my mantra was that we protect the integrity of the division. What does the Internal Affairs Bureau do? We conduct citizen complaint investigations. We conduct internal allegations of misconduct investigations. We conduct criminal investigations of division personnel, or we work in conjunction with specific bureaus to conduct those investigations. We conduct investigations of EEO or bias within the division, and we conduct investigations for investigations that are sensitive or newsworthy or directed by the chief. I may have shot myself in the foot here because I added some animations bringing up. That's just more that I have to push the button here, right? What IAB does not do, and what we do not investigate. And so I've been at a few of your meetings. There was some misinformation, and I want to clarify some of that. In the Columbus Division of Police, the Internal Affairs Bureau does not conduct investigations into officer-involved shootings. Those investigations are criminal investigations conducted by the Critical Incident Response Team, a seasoned group of homicide detectives. The only way that the Internal Affairs Bureau becomes involved in that is if there is a complaint involved with that officer-involved shooting. For instance, in a recent officer-involved shooting, there was a complaint from a citizen that an official report was not taken. So at the conclusion of that criminal investigation, we will conduct, if it's not addressed in the criminal investigation, we will conduct an administrative investigation regarding that complaint. IAB does not normally investigate uses of force by officers. Every use of force by a Columbus Division of Police officer is reported by that officer to their supervisor, which is usually a patrol supervisor in most cases. Internal Affairs does not conduct that administrative investigation unless there is an accompanying complaint. IAB does not recommend discipline. So at the conclusion of our investigation, we make a recommendation as to the disposition of the complaint, sustained, not sustained, which I'll go over shortly, but we don't recommend discipline. And if you come in to file a complaint with Internal Affairs, or you call, or you send us a Facebook message, we do not require you to come in person. We don't require you to swear to a complaint. We don't require you to write down your complaint. You can make a complaint in several different ways, and we'll go over those as well. What should a complaint system provide within a division of police? It should provide a system of accountability and transparency to allow for the trust of the citizens in that city, as well as the Division of Police, the employees. We should identify problematic behaviors and work to correct those behaviors. We work with ears and we work with chains of command to correct those behaviors. Who is in our internal affairs in the city of Columbus? So our internal affairs, it's really interesting when we have outside auditors come in, especially if they come from another agency to provide an analysis on our internal affairs. They're always surprised by how many personnel we have within internal affairs. We have one commander, that's me. We have two internal affairs lieutenants. They joined me today, Lieutenant Amy Haley, Lieutenant Bela Bernhardt, first and second shift lieutenants. We have 24 sergeants that are assigned to internal affairs. They are all sworn division supervisors. 20 of those sergeants are full-time investigators. They do nothing but investigate complaints and allegations in those complaints. 4 of those sergeants are full-time intake personnel. And so we have an intake desk. It's an actual office located at 750 East Long Street. Those sergeants work from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m. There's someone at that desk, and they handle walk-ins, they handle phone calls, emails, Facebook messages, tweets. They represent the division regarding a number of topics, as you will see as I go into some of the statistics. And what is a citizen complaint? And this is by directive. This is by our rule, but it's also a national standard. It's a complaint made by individual or individuals against a division employee. As I said, those complaints can also be from a third party. You don't have to be present at an incident to file a complaint on an officer. For instance, we took a complaint last week on a traffic stop. A young lady, 17 years old, was stopped by a freeway officer. She was by herself driving. Related to her mom, how rude she felt the officer was. Mom called in a complaint on the officer. Mom was not present. We will investigate that complaint. We also handle anonymous complaints. Now, contractually, there are some guidelines that we must follow on an anonymous complaint. Pretty general, we have to corroborate some portion of that complaint in order to conduct an investigation. A complaint is an allegation of misconduct that, if true, would be a violation of law, division rule of policy, or division policy. What happens in sustained, and so sustained is the key word there. What can happen to employees during sustained serious or criminal allegations? So our officers can be suspended, they can be removed from their assignment, they can be reassigned, they can be terminated, or they can be criminally charged. And all of those have happened in my tenure in Internal Affairs. Again, Internal Affairs is just an investigative body. We don't make recommendations regarding discipline. And let's talk about our dispositions. So when we conduct an investigation, one of these dispositions is recommended by the investigator in Internal Affairs. That case is then reviewed by one of the lieutenants. It is then reviewed by me. That recommendation and that investigation goes out to the chain of command, and it starts out with the sergeant or the first level supervisor, all the way through the chain of command. They either agree or disagree with our recommended disposition. The final say, absent serious or critical misconduct, is at the deputy chief level, and the deputy chief may change our recommended disposition. And then it comes back to Internal Affairs for filing, for records filing. Does anybody need me to go over these? These are standard across the country. Preponderance of the evidence is our gauge, 51% either way. Some complaint statistics, just to give all of you a gauge of where we're at in Columbus. So in 2017, I use 2017 because Lieutenant Haley and Lieutenant Bernhardt were kind enough to pass out our annual report from last year. That's our last full year of statistics. Our investigators at intake, our sergeants at our intake desk had 2,673 citizen contacts. Those contacts resulted in 308 complaint investigations. Of those 308, 45% of those were unfounded after investigation, 10% not sustained, 10% sustained, and 16% exonerated. Other is withdrawn, canceled, fall in those classifications.
What's the distinction between unfounded and not sustained?
And so if we go back, unfounded, alleged conduct is refuted. It's refuted by a preponderance of the evidence. And you said not sustained, Director? And so not sustained, it couldn't be supported or refuted. Either way, by a preponderance of the evidence. Does that distinction make sense to everyone? Intake calls received over the last 3 years. You'll notice here that this is only intake. So our intake sergeants in 2017 handled 2,673 intake calls, or walk-ins, or emails. In 2016, 2,100. and in 2015, 2,740. I added the total calls that did not allege misconduct, and you might say, well, why are they calling IAB then? I'll give you a for instance. And this has specifically changed, I would say, over the last 5 years. If there is an incident in Columbus, a protest, a high-profile arrest, that is not just local news. It's on Twitter, it's on Facebook. It is not uncommon for me to touch base with our intake sergeants and make certain that we have additional staff if there's a high-profile arrest. We may get calls from Canada, we may get calls from Europe. People just would like to offer their opinion. And during a recent high-profile termination in the city of a police officer, we had nearly 100 calls from people around the world that merely wanted to offer their opinion on why he did what he did. I don't want to file a complaint. I just would like for it to be on record that that officer did that because, and I'm a police trainer in France. How did you see this? It's all over Facebook. And so the dynamic has changed a bit. And so many calls come in, just people wanting to offer their opinion. Total citizen complaints investigated, received by year. 308 in 2017, 382 in 2016, and 289 in 2015. Year to date, we have 226 complaints year to date. That was yesterday. I looked up the number. Total allegations, and so in one complaint, there may be numerous allegations. The officer was rude when he arrested me, and he had no right to arrest me. That's probably a couple of allegations: rudeness and unlawful arrest. And so there's 2 allegations in one complaint. So in the last 3 years, 2017, we had 701 allegations. 2016, 784 allegations, and 2015, 638 allegations. Year to date, we have 479 allegations contained in those 226 complaints. What are our most common complaints? And so this is the most interesting. Usually when I'm talking to a group who are not police officers with no prior experience, I ask them, what do you think the most common complaint in a city like Columbus would be? And I'm always surprised by the suggestions. They're usually off base. So you can see from our statistics, actions taken or not taken was our #1 complaint last year. That officer had no right to tow my car. Actions taken or not taken. The officer wrote me a ticket. He shouldn't have written me a ticket. Rudeness is our #2 complaint, and that includes profanity, by the way. Rudeness, profanity. 16% of our complaints dealt with rudeness or profanity last year. Improper force, 12%. Improper search or seizure, 9%. And the others are a myriad of complaints. I added this slide, policy issues identified. And so as our investigators conduct investigations into citizen complaints, increasingly we have access to video evidence. And as we review that video evidence, if we identify additional policy issues that were not part of the original complaint, we feel that it's necessary to point that out to the chains of command to rectify. And so let's say, for instance, you'll see uniform accounts for 24% of our policy issues. Generally speaking, that is an officer not wearing their hat. And so it is a division directive that an officer should wear their hat when they're out of their car. We'll point that out to the chain of command so they can resolve that, or at least point it out and talk to the officer about it. CVS microphone, that's a dwindling number. Prior to the body-worn camera, officers wore a microphone on their belt that synced with the cruiser video system in their car. They had to manually turn on that microphone to pick up their conversations outside of the cruiser. EVO is emergency vehicle operations. If they use lights and sirens when they should not have, we'll point that out and let the chain of command resolve that. And rude and discourteous, we'll point that out too. We feel that it's important to raise policy issues that were violated that were not part of the original complaint. As I looked at this and had a few other people review this, I know this is a bit of a confusing slide, but my takeaway on this slide is to show you all how video evidence has changed citizen complaint investigations. And this is really evolving. In May of this year, the Division of Police had 100% of our patrol officers have body-worn cameras. And so these statistics come from last year, when we had a portion of the patrol officers with body-worn cameras. But there was additional video evidence as well, cruiser videos, cell phone video. But if you take a look at this, what struck me as the biggest difference in cases with video evidence is the unfoundeds are 20% higher than cases with no video evidence. Statistically speaking, and this is becoming clearer the more cases we have with body-worn camera video, but statistically speaking, unfounded went very high. In our statistics last year, exonerateds were down, withdrawals were down, sustains were down, and not sustains were all down with video evidence. I can tell you this year withdrawals are up based upon video evidence, and I'll relate a little bit of that. It's an interesting study in how memory works. Questions about this slide? I know it is not the clearest. Who files complaints in the city of Columbus? In 2017, our demographics were 44% of our complaints were filed by women, 43% were filed by men, 43% were filed by African Americans, 34% were filed by Caucasians, 10% were unknown. If you call in or you send us an email, we're not going to ask you, what is your race, what is your gender? We're going to investigate the complaint. Pretty broad range of ages here, 21 to 50. 59% of our complaints are filed by people in that age range. Of all of the complaints that we take, 68% of our complainants are cooperative throughout the investigation, and 32% are not cooperative. So when I say they're not cooperative, our IAB sergeants are required to make 3 attempts via phone to contact the complainant, and then I add another step. I recommend that you go knock on the person's door, especially if there's someone local. I want people to know that we are taking their complaints seriously. That backfires sometimes because I often use this analogy. If I go to Kroger today and I'm not happy with the clerk that checks me out, and I walk up to the desk to complain on the clerk, I don't expect that someone's going to knock on my door within 3 days and want to interview me about my interaction with that clerk. So I think some people are surprised about how seriously we take complaints. How our complaints are received, you can see overall, overwhelmingly, telephone is the overwhelming majority of our complaints, 57%. 17% are in person. People come into our offices at 750 East Long. Email or internet, and so that includes Facebook, Twitter. 2% by mail, and I added just internally, 0.6% of our complaints. What else does IAB do other than internal investigations? We track and we analyze bias-based profiling annually to give you a gauge on the number to review. Last year, 2,673 contacts by our intake sergeants resulted in 308 complaint investigations, 701 allegations. Of those 701 allegations, 11 of them were bias-based profiling. The officer stopped me because I'm black. I got a ticket because I'm Hispanic. Those are difficult to prove oftentimes. Preponderance of the evidence. These are the additional records that IAB is, we are the keeper of these records. And so I often tell citizens groups, if you want to know anything about our uses of force, if you want to know about our records, I have that information. It's all public record. And I'm happy to give that to you. I'm happy to come and talk to groups about that. A recent group wanted to know the race and sex of every officer involved in a shooting and the race and sex of every suspect that was shot. We have that information. We track that, we analyze that. What else do? We try to heavily be involved in community interaction. I ask that all the sergeants identify community organizations, community groups, meetings, block watches, police, citizen panels that they can be part of, and regularly take part in those. I'm sorry that I missed the presentation earlier about early intervention systems. I really would like to have seen that. This is the most comprehensive list of best practices for internal affairs bureaus. And I added at the bottom, if you can see it, this was created in 2005. This was created by a grant through the COPS office, and they seated 15 of the largest cities in the country, their internal affairs commanders, their chiefs, and they sat at a table and said, what are the best practices for internal affairs bureaus? It's a little dated. That is the most recent list of best practices. Intake, widely available. They actually add on a bus line. Complaint forms in different languages. I brought examples of our complaint forms. The three primary languages that we deal with in internal affairs, English, Spanish, and Somali. I brought examples of those. And then you can see some of the other best practices. This is not all-encompassing. External audits. We welcome external audits. You are welcome to come to our Internal Affairs Bureau. You as a commissioner, at the end you'll see my contact information. Call, email, you're welcome to come up. If you want to spend a day in Internal Affairs, you are welcome to spend a day in Internal Affairs. I see everyone's very excited about that. Some of the recent audits that we've had, so the division has been accredited by CALEA since 1999. We were awarded the highest designation last year with excellence. That includes our Internal Affairs Bureau. In addition, I was part of the governor's collaborative study that started 3 years ago. There are very few standards on that collaborative, but the City of Columbus and Internal Affairs abides by all of them. And finally, in 2016, PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, was commissioned by the city to come and do an audit specifically of the Internal Affairs Bureau. They spent weeks in the Internal Affairs Bureau, reviewed investigations, interviewed personnel, and came out with a report in late 2016. What are some frequently asked questions that I get at community meetings and meetings that I conduct? How can I file a complaint against a police officer? You can file a complaint really any way you'd like. You can call us, you can come into our office at 750 East Long, you can email us, you can put it on Facebook, you can tell a police officer that you know, and they will forward the complaint to us. You can call our patrol office downtown, they will fill out a complaint form and forward it to us. Can I file a complaint anonymously? I've probably reviewed that ad nauseum. Yes, we investigate anonymous complaints and third-party complaints. And how long does it take to investigate a complaint? I think, Mr. Carter, you came up with that question a few meetings ago. How long does it take to do an internal investigation? So contractually, we're allotted 90 days, generally speaking, but it doesn't take us that long. Year to date, first shift, it takes about just over 40 days to complete an internal investigation. Second shift, it takes just over 50 days. Still some work to do in those avenues, but I look at that from a few different standpoints. If I'm the citizen that made the complaint, I would like some sort of a resolution quickly. And if I'm that employee that gets a complaint, it might be a very minor complaint, but it might mean the world to me. I would like the truth to come out. So that we try to expedite those investigations thoroughly and efficiently for both citizens and employees. There's my contact information. You are welcome to call me, contact me. If you're with groups that you want to know the answers to policies, procedures, I will be happy to talk to you or any group about facts within the Columbus Division of Police. I can talk to you about the policies that we have. I can talk to you about how those policies were developed, and I can talk to you about the current statistics that we have. I'm also happy to talk about any internal investigation that is concluded. As long as it's not still going through the arbitration process, the disciplinary process, I'd be more than happy to come and talk to you about that. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
When you were talking about the bias complaints and them being difficult to prove, do you track like the number of complaints an officer gets, whether it's supported or not, whether it's sustained or not? And so do you also track, like, let's say one particular officer gets a lot of bias complaints that we can't prove? Do you track that?
Yes. Yes, if I enter an officer's name, if I entered Lieutenant Amy Haley into our database, which is, it's called Premier One, it's a Motorola records management system, it will show me all of the complaints that she's been a part of. The only caveat to that, the exception, would be if those complaints are investigated and unfounded, remember that's refuted by a preponderance of the evidence, then she can write a letter, she can make a request at the conclusion of the investigation to have her name removed from that investigation, if it's an unfounded complaint. That does not happen very often, I'll tell you, but that provision is in the contract.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
A follow-up question on your data on complaints received and total allegations. Do you know why you had an increase in 2016 and then why it went down in 17?
I don't know that. I can tell you that we had a leadership change in early 2017. I took over internal affairs. Anecdotally, I can tell you that we see trends related to protests. And so if we have a large protest where there is any enforcement action, that is generally followed by an increase in complaints. And so that's anecdotally, I can tell you that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Pat?
Commander, 2 questions for you. One, it says how complaints are received, internal memo, 0.6%.
That's
So
correct.
I did the math, it's about 18 or so in 2017. Are those typically from commanders who are submitting something to you for their personnel? Or is that, like you said, somebody tells an officer they know when they submit it to you?
You're pretty close. It was 17 in 2017. We have about 7 more year-to-date this year, about 24. And to answer your question, it's generally not from a commander. What we have seen is from one officer complaining on another officer, or from a civilian employee complaining on another civilian employee. We don't just conduct investigations of sworn personnel. If you call 911 today and you believe that the call taker was rude, we handle that investigation. So we will conduct that investigation. If you are a fingerprint tech and you think that your fellow fingerprint tech is creating a hostile work environment, you might write a letter and ask that IAB investigate that, which we would.
Is there a policy that requires an employee of the Division of Police to submit that via internal memo versus anonymously? So if I were a fingerprint tech,
right,
and Tracy's a fingerprint tech, I wouldn't submit a memo that says, I don't like Tracy because of this, this, and that. I'd submit it anonymously because I don't want to create stuff in the, so is it policy or is it by choice?
So internally, we do not accept anonymous complaints internally.
That's what I'm asking. Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
and there is policy. You asked that. The policy does allow for a deviation of chain of command. So if I have a complaint against my supervisor, who's the chief of police, I would probably go to Director Speaks. And so we do see a circumvention of the chain of command with those.
And that makes sense. My second question is, so you have the flyers and you have the 3 languages. If someone non-English speaking calls in, is there a way that they can make their complaint, or do they have to come in person?
They do not have to come in person. So we have a language line that we use that the city contracts with. And so our sergeant will put that person on hold. It'll be essentially a 3-way call with a translator from this company that contracts with the city. And that does happen, yes.
Cool. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Here, and then to Jason. Yes, Aaron. Were your hand up? Oh, Jason.
So you mentioned that you could talk about, I guess, complaints that have, I guess, been finalized or Did you say that?
I do. Those are all public records, sir.
Public
And so if you're interested in an investigation conducted by Internal Affairs, that's all public record.
Okay, I guess, okay, that's good to know. So I'm just wondering, would it be possible if we, I guess as a group or body could have the opportunity or at some point to maybe review some of those complaints? I guess my concern, just looking at the statistics of unfounded, not sustained, exonerated, I guess that 10% sustained, I'm wondering would a group of, I guess, civilians, or would their findings coincide with the reviews done by police?
Sure.
Of police, and that's kind of, that's a concern that I have when I look at it. And some of the gentlemen had mentioned it earlier as well, the need for just citizens to be involved in that process. So
that's why I urge you, sir, if you have questions or you see something in the news, I'm happy to talk about it. I'll meet you for a cup of coffee, talk about it over the phone, whatever you're comfortable with. And that, whether or not you review internal investigations, I will certainly provide those, whatever you would like. I'll provide copies for you. I always tell a really interesting story, and I touched upon it earlier, about human memory. And so we're seeing some really, really interesting case studies with body-worn cameras. And I relate a case that we had earlier in the year. The complaint was, and these two complaints came in pretty quickly after the incident. They were so descriptive that I pulled up the body camera at my desk and I watched the body camera footage from the 3 officers that were present. And the complaint was, I was out running. I'm a coach at a high school. I'm a track coach. And I was with my other track coach, and we were running with our track athletes. And we saw a horrendous traffic accident. This child was on a motorcycle and he wrecked. He was in the middle of the street. He was lifeless. These 3 officers showed up and they cursed at us and they shoved us out of the street. And I thought, that really sounds bad. So as I do when I look at the complaints, the first thing I do is see, is there associated body camera footage? I watched all 3 body camera footages, and at the end of that, I asked myself, were there other cruisers on scene? So we have the ability to look and see, did any other cars respond? Because what the complaint was, the very descriptive complaint, was not in any of the footage. And I thought, well, that's interesting. We assigned it for investigation. By SOP, one of the first things that our sergeant does is review that body camera footage. He contacts the complainants and says, here's what I have as your complaint. All of our intake is audio taped, so we know exactly what was said over the telephone. We conduct an in-person interview just to verify, is this sometimes at a chaotic scene, what you say over the phone and what actually you might say it's a little bit different. That's exactly what happened. The officer shoved us out of the street. They cursed at us. Do you mind if we review the videotape? And so we will review the videotape, the body-worn camera video, with the complainants. And this was really interesting, only because there were 2 complainants, and they were right next to each other. And so the first complainant watched the videotape, and he said, by the way, there was no physical contact from any of the officers with any of the witnesses. They handled it as a textbook fatal accident. When they arrived at scene, there was a nurse tending to the young man. They said, let's everyone step out of the road. Did anyone witness this? And then they began to secure the scene and interview witnesses. The first coach that watched the video said, that's not how I remember that happening. This was a week ago, and that's not how I remember that happening. The second coach watched the video, and he said, you doctored the video. We don't have the capability of doctoring videos. And if we go in to look at the video, it's audited. So anytime that anyone looks at a body-worn camera video or copies it, it's audited. We can see who did that and specifically what they did. And so I just found that a really interesting. So videos it's clarifying some of our complaints. Yeah, but I would welcome any complaints that you have personal knowledge of. Please take a look at our investigation. If you think we missed something, should do something differently.
Yeah, I'm not thinking of a specific case
Sure.
in general. I understand.
Yeah.
The concerned about the numbers. Yeah. Okay. Sean?
So a few questions. One, when it comes to body-worn cameras, are cell phone cameras by civilians equally weighted in value for you in terms of your investigation, considering that body-worn camera is a single perspective and there's another side to that story?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of things that you need to take into account when you're watching video. The angle the video is taken from, is it dark out? What did the lens see? What did the human eye see? Remember, though, all we can do, the majority of our investigations are administrative in nature. They are not criminal in nature. And so the most we can do is ask you as a private citizen, could I have a copy of your cell phone video? And oftentimes, even out of the 68% that are cooperative, oftentimes people will say no. At that point, we don't know what is videotaped on their phone. But if we are able to obtain cell phone video, absolutely, it's equally weighted with body-worn camera.
And so the other question I have on that is, when your investigation dispositions are finalized, are your findings discoverable in civil and criminal cases?
It's public record, so yes.
Right, so it's public record, but I guess what I'm asking is there a scenario where whether you exonerate or not, would you then have to potentially take the stand and to kind of talk about your investigative process as part of that case?
That routinely happens in civil cases. In fact, I just got off the phone with Susan Thompson on the way in here asking for some information about a case that we investigated that is now a civil case. So that does routinely happen on civil cases. I can't think of, the investigator would obviously testify in a criminal case if they were the primary investigator, but I can't, and I know we've had investigators prepared to testify in criminal investigations, but I don't know that they have actually taken the stand.
And then the last question I would have is, when it comes to who files complaints, is there any way that you could share with us a disaggregated number by age that kind of narrows the band? Just because 21 to 50 is such a wide band, and it's such a 59% is a huge population. Could we get that narrowed by age band, and then also go younger as well to teenagers?
Yes, it might be in there. Let me take a look real quick.
Well, and while you're looking, one last question, and I'm sorry, Chair.
Sure.
Oh, so it's in the annual report. Okay. So then the last question is, when a citizen is engaging in discussion with an officer, I just don't know this, so this is my own personal ignorance, and I acknowledge it, is if I request the badge number, is the officer obliged to give it to me? And then what information do you need for a complaint to be a good starting point for you to do a thorough investigation?
We have so many redundant, overlapping systems that you can be extremely general regarding a complaint. You can give me a street corner and a date, and we can probably determine what officer was there.
Okay.
And now there's probably body-worn camera footage of that. Or there's community crime camera footage of it, or there's cruiser video footage of it. We can likely, with very general information, in regards to the badge number, that is policy. If you as a citizen are having a conversation with me and say, I'd like your badge number, we are required by policy to provide you with that badge number, yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Is that badge number and name, or just badge number?
I'd have to look at the policy. Kelly, do you know off the top of your head? Okay.
We don't have to write it down for you.
I have to write it
We have
down.
to give it to you. So if you say, write that down for you, but we have to.
Okay, so that's part of my next question. I've seen a number of cases where it's been requested and they say, you can see it, it's right here, you can read it. The officer has to verbally provide it to someone, not just.
It is not spelled out that in the policy that's
Okay.
you have to provide it. So that, I guess, would be a situation where you had, could you
A
actually see
complaint for
this?
rudeness. Perfect.
Could be, yes. Are you asking for her badge number? Is that what you're doing?
No, I'm not. No, I mean, realistically, like I said, I've seen
Yes.
it a number of times, and I think there's a number of issues between access and functional needs.
Sure.
I don't have my glasses on, or the officer being purposely standoffish. Like, I can't read, I'm assuming that says Quinlan from here, but I can't read that. So,
Right.
that kind of customer service.
Sure, of course.
So, good question, Sean.
Do get disciplined frequently for that. They'll say, it's on your ticket, just read it there. They'll refuse to answer, basically saying, it's on your ticket, and they get disciplined, so.
Other questions?
Are there other questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. The agenda didn't include any sort of wrap-up. It just says adjourn, but any comments, concerns? Yes, Matt?
Hold us till 5:30. But I was looking at the original draft meeting summary that we got. It looks something like this. It has the 7 steps with all of the meetings that were suggested to have. And I was noticing between 6 and 7, I feel like there's a major step missing that we as commissioners need to discuss. It goes from the community engagement piece, wrapping everything up, to the commissioner's recommendations, consultant. Are we going to have actual meetings to discuss the recommendations?
Oh, yes.
Because it kind of looks like it.
No, there are a number of meetings that will probably not be on there. So, for example, I'm not sure if you were you at the last meeting? I was. Well, remember I shared that we're going to have to add meetings for citizen input?
Yeah.
So that was sort of an outline, but it's not in stone. The internal committee will meet to see if there are other subjects. I'll ask, as I've done before, the commissioners if there are other, subjects. So no, that was a solid outline that, quite frankly, Director Speaks put together for us. We've added other things. One of the things that I'm thinking about that we talked about, and I don't think we've left the list, was whether or not we specifically wanted to hear more about juveniles and training specifically. So I don't think that was on the list, and we may still, do that.
Sure.
I would say it's not an exhaustive list.
Okay, so I agree with that. My point is to, like, Andrew, you provided your brief earlier. As we go through more meetings and more the subcommittees meet, I would like us to have an opportunity to not only brief out, but then discuss the recommendations from each committee as we're putting together the recommendations before the consultant's report. What is the consultant going to report on if we don't give them our recommendations, is what I'm asking.
We will have, I won't say constant communication, but we will be in touch, with Matrix and the folks. There will be a sharing of information, if that's what you're saying. But the quizzical look I had was I want to be real careful around recommendations. We heard a report today from APIT on hiring. We will hear more. I am not taking those as recommendations. At some point, the subcommittee will come in and say, after all that we've heard, this is what we think. And so certainly at that point, the commissioners will have a chance to talk about that. Is that
Okay.
what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what I'm
Yeah,
asking.
okay, yes.
So turning
Yeah.
our suggestions from the groups into recommendations from the
Yes,
whole group.
yes, yes.
Okay. Perfect, thank you.
Okay.
I have 3 minutes left.
And I do believe we have one more meeting scheduled for this calendar year, December the 13th. I think it's the last meeting that we have scheduled, and that's probably, realistic. Brian, I didn't have a chance to share this with you, but since Richard mentioned it today, I think I should share this with the commissioners. So we've talked about Matrix holding focus groups in our neighborhoods. And at some point, and maybe I was even the person who said it, I thought that the commissioners would be invited to be a part of that. Our consultants believe that is not a good idea in terms of being able to, I think we're going to engage a local consultant that we already have, Materian Wright. But the thinking is we shouldn't overwhelm, I don't even know how many people are going to be in the room. And so I know that at least in terms of my planning, looking ahead, I was planning on having all of these additional meetings. But with their experience in other communities, they think that is not a good idea. So I just wanted to share that with you today.
Is that the group as a whole?
Or can we be invited to, I'd like to be at the one in my neighborhood, to see what they're reporting? Are they suggesting no
And they
commissioners?
might suggest that because you are a commissioner and then whatever, that you not be there. So I will certainly ask them, but you could, they want everyone in the room to be able to be, free and able to talk, et cetera. And we might think that our presence is not in any way intimidating or whatever, but we don't know what's in the mind of the individuals who are in the room. So I really think on this one, we're going to take the advice of, we can talk about the specific, but, if you want to go and so and so and so and so, it can quickly add up. So, but I wanted to just give you that today. Again, I'm not saying it, not saying it's cast.
They want to meet with us individually, though.
Pardon?
But they want to meet with us.
Yes, individually. If you didn't hear that when you came in, I met with Richard Brady, the president of Matrix today, and, we just had a good, conversation. He raised the possibility of them being able to meet with you. What was my thought? I said I thought it was a great idea. They will receive your information from, the city, and there's a staff person who sends you an email, gives you some times, and you work it all out. Okay? We're adjourned. Again, thank you for an excellent meeting.